Leo.
When my kid's sister was 25, she started to go a little funny in the head. She was working in yet another bookstore, and when customers went into the section with the art books, she put down whatever she was doing and kind of followed them. Or maybe stalked them is a better word. There in the aisle, she started talking to them about why they were there, what they liked, what they disliked, and if they drew or painted or sculpted, because she did too. Meanwhile, a line would be forming at the register. This voluntary engagement with strangers wasn't at all like Nadia, who held retail customers especially in the same general regard as plague rats. Her growing need to feel more connected to her lifelong calling was suddenly causing her to ceaselessly pester innocent people who usually just wanted to snag the cheapest possible coffee table book on the Impressionists so they could have something to give their Aunt Debbie for Christmas. One night, Nadia came back to the house after her closing shift, and she looked a little stunned, a little glassy-eyed. She poked at a microwave pizza and told me her boss, Nathan, had pulled her aside that night and explained, politely and sympathetically, that she'd been over $2 off in counting her register across a 30-day period, and technically this meant he had to write her up. But he knew that, hey, it could happen to anyone, it really wasn't a big deal, and Nathan was in tight with the district manager, so it was just a record-keeping formality, no formal discipline. Just could she maybe keep an eye on counting the change a wee bit better? And sign on the line where it said, "I accept the suggestion for an improvement in performance." "I've been written up," Nadia said to me wonderingly, staring out the kitchen window at the cold rain outside. And then she told me she thought it was finally time to sell her my van. I'll always remember the silence after that. It went on for so long and so dramatically that we both finally bust out laughing at the sudden profundity of the moment. But she was serious. Somehow, she never seemed physically smaller to me than when we went out the side door and she stood beside the van in the garage. I'd teasingly called her low shelf when we were kids until she ripped my Cal Ripken baseball card in half and I almost cried, even though I was 5.5 years older than she was. She never did get that much taller, and the van was definitely not designed for people of her modest height. It had just been cooling its heels in the garage since I'd bought it used 7 years before. It wasn't looking so hot. Back then, I was going to fix it up for an epic drive across the states and into Alaska, then maybe all the way down to Guadalajara. A year-long odyssey of self-indulgence. I even had this journal where I'd listed in advance all the stops I was going to make in between. Filled in a good 24 pages during my 20s. Made doodles of road signs. But then I let work happen, and when I had the clear chance to put an end to that for a year, I somehow found myself letting my bank account suggest taking another job. And then my sickness came along, so here sat the van year after year. A 2004 Ford E150 that was getting older faster than even we were. Nadia sat in the driver's seat and fiddled with the knobs and then poked around the back, asking me what she needed to know about the feeble attempts at winterization I'd made and forgotten by now. She had that extremely studious look on her face throughout, like Sherlock Holmes examining a crime scene. The price we agreed on for the purchase of the van was, I think, $20. And she'd have to sacrifice the last half of the Pepperidge Farm chocolate fudge cake she'd bought at Wegmans the day before. My heart waited to break outright till we got back in the kitchen. Not that I let on to Nadia that it did. She planned to leave, she said, in a week. I already kind of knew the answer to the question of where she was headed, so she simply confirmed that for me. I'd never seen her so determined, so any arguments against her plan didn't seem very smart. It definitely did something to me, giving her the keys to the thing which was supposed to be the grand adventure of my youth. I knew that whatever craziness might happen to me on the road to Mexico, I could have dealt with it. I wasn't sure at all, though, that Nadia was prepared for what she was getting into. This was a girl so shy growing up that when she was 16, our father had set a brochure for an assertiveness training class on the desk in her room. It mysteriously disappeared after that, never to be mentioned. I think it had embarrassed Nadia. I offered to go with her on her trip, which of course was ridiculous because I had a big boy mortgage, and now Nadia's contribution to that was going to have to go away for a while, if she was going to survive. No, she said she had to do this alone. She did offer me an out clause, which was that if I got even the slightest bit sicker, if there was even the slightest wrinkle added to the course the doctors had been keeping me on tediously for 10 months now, making me so tired sometimes that changing the channel felt like too much work, she'd come back immediately. Here was my little secret. I never had any intention of telling her if I got sicker. The odd little blonde girl who drew strange pictures in class and needed me to chase off the odd third-grade bully or two had just shown more courage in asking for that van than I'd ever shown in my whole life. And I wasn't about to stand in the way of her own grand adventure. I didn't understand it all, really. I didn't get how this all-or-nothing fire had grown in someone who had to be reminded to please speak up most of her life. We can't hear you. To me, life wasn't about reaching some moment where you finally needed to be what you were born to be and nothing else. Thinking back now on us in the kitchen, I do see that, yeah, one more retail job or one more year of wondering what if might have been the year that took her fire away for good. You never know what's going to take it away. And I don't think you notice at first that it's gone. Paint hard and well, I told her, and for God's sake, at least have the common decency to become a millionaire at it. We ate fudge cake together as the rain fell. And 7 days later, when I came back from rustling tax returns all day, there was just a big empty space on the cement where the van used to be. The ghosts of oil leaks past, embedded there permanently. Nadia had left a note for me saying she'd figured out from YouTube how to change out the spark plugs, so she was on her way to Cleveland after lunch. At the bottom, she'd done her usual thing of drawing her face, screwed up into some kind of ridiculous expression. I don't think she ever realized how skilled and vivid those silly faces of hers were. I felt so alone that night I had to have a Price is Right marathon playing in the living room as I finished up with some papers from the office. I went into Nadia's room and I looked at the awards she'd won in high school for her art. Before I went to bed, I took out my old journal with all my planned van stops written in it and gave them all a nostalgia read. Then I put the thing away for good. The next time I heard from Nadia, it was a text message from 2 states away, telling me she'd arrived at her destination safely. And I suppose you could say that was when the second part of her life began.
Nadia.
It's one thing to look at a van in your brother's garage and think, oh, wow, that's kind of big. And it's another thing to actually head out in it and feel like you're basically driving the moon down the road. But I got the 400 miles to Cleveland somehow without dinging any fenders, and I guess that was all I could hope for in the beginning. That was the trip that gave me my first experience at a Cracker Barrel, which I guess went okay. I was the only one in there eating alone. I bought my brother a cheesy sweatshirt with the Cracker Barrel logo on it for his birthday in May, but then I turned around the parking lot and returned it, feeling really lousy that I had to. I was already becoming obsessed with how much money I was spending. For now, his birthday present was going to have to be me returning to Lancaster without having lost more than 10 pounds from being hungry all the time. I got so lost trying to avoid a toll stretch on I-76 that I probably wound up spending more money on gas, but it did lead me past a strip mall to the Museum of British Tin Soldiers, which an older guy dressed like a British tin soldier ran out of the former in-law's house on his property. He let me do a self-guided tour, and it only cost me $3. Plus, his dachshund followed me around and even tried to get into the van. That gave me one more oddball museum visit to add to my very slowly growing list. Coming to Cleveland from the east took me through Pittsburgh, and I thought, okay, I'll splurge on a heated cabin at the KOA campground, which I figured would be a little safer than a motel at the same price. I had fun folding out the little wooden parts of the room from the walls, the eating table, the bed, a little shelf below a mirror. Beyond that, it was still kind of vaguely terrifying, and I wondered about the kind of people who wanted to stay at a KOA outside Latrobe in early March. I went into the shower hut the next morning and looked at the cold water dripping off the old red spout from the previous person, and the water ghosts staining the cement below it, and I just couldn't bring myself to use it. I tried to remember the last time I didn't shower in the morning. It might have been at a summer camp when I was 11. I was afraid to go too far off the route the GPS suggested. I told myself there'd be days and days to walk around and explore Cleveland, and decided to drive right to Vermilion Common. But I took a wrong turn and wound up in a rough patch near Buckeye Shaker for a bit. It was cold and gray, and a whole city block was closed because there was black smoke floating up gently from a high row of windows in a junior high school that looked abandoned. It was almost pretty how symmetrically the smoke wafted out from each window and made the exact kind of silent twisting path on the way upward to the sky. 2 kids on bikes were playing some game of hopping their wheels up on the curb right next to a fire truck, and a cop shooed them away angrily. They were maybe 8 years old. I was at a stoplight, and I watched them drop their bikes with a crash outside a convenience store with a weave of rusted iron bars obscuring the ads for cigarettes and lotto tickets. They ran inside past a woman with a cane. The van started to make a sound from under the dash on the glove compartment side, like 5 pounds of wet chocolate pudding were moving around inside a garbage bag. That's literally the only way to describe it. It had first happened back around Coriopolis, and I was really happy to finally reach Vermilion Common. I had thought it would be fun to officially give the van a name, kind of make it a friend so it would never let me down. But nothing ever felt right, and sometimes I guess a van really is just a van. There was no sign marking Vermilion Common, and even 2.5 years after it first sprang up, there was probably no official piece of paper anywhere with that name on it. It was just a 4-block square in the Mansheim district between a big industrial maze of body shops and warehouses and a little residential grid of hurting walk-ups with sub-shops and nail salons and dollar stores beneath them. There was always a graffiti problem, but the people of Vermilion Common were aggressive in taking care of these 4 blocks. Tuesdays were cleanup days. I'd read about it online for 6 months, and I was hoping the informal rules as I understood them from web forums hadn't changed much. I parked the van on the curb behind another one that was practically the same make and model, just an unhealthier looking green than my baby. Its owner, who was sitting in a folding chair on the sidewalk and reading an Ellery Queen mystery, had its rear doors propped open, like most people living in Vermilion Common did on any given Thursday through Sunday. Nate would be my very first friend in the artist's colony. He had several paintings hung neatly inside the van. So right away, I was hoping here was someone who could show me how to manage that engineering trick too. He had some other easels on the sidewalk. Up and down the block from Pound Street to 16th Avenue, then across the way, around a corner, and down to Thornton Street, about 80 other people had taken advantage of a loophole in the local parking laws to take up at least part-time residents in their vehicles. The art displays were pretty sparse when it wasn't an actual weekend, but even for 1 o'clock on a Thursday, the vibe was pleasant enough. The working-class residents of the neighborhood occasionally came and went, ignoring the artists mostly. I didn't see more than 8 or 10 passerby actually checking out anyone's work until rush hour began over on Ebbett Avenue. But that was fine, really. I was nervous, and I could do with the peace and quiet till I knew which way was up. Nate had a big white beard and a prominent potbelly. He wore a Hawaiian shirt and a cabana hat with a lizard design, and he was smiling from the first moment I met him. I told him I needed to throw myself on the mercy of strangers and asked him if it was all right to park where I did, because I wanted to try and stay a while. He told me I'd basically just won the lottery because the woman who'd been taking up that particular space had gone home to Santa Fe just the day before, and the only other spot seemed to be all the way down Thornton in front of a pawn shop. "You just settle right in and I'll be your tour guide today," Nate said, still smiling, and I felt a wave of relief that reminded me how tense I'd been all morning. He took me from van to van and minibus to minibus, or even just a station wagon once in a while, trying to introduce me to the people he knew. Most of them were either off working somewhere or nearby in the apartments they lived in, almost always sharing with 1, 2, or 3 other people. But sometimes a door would slide open and someone would poke their head out of a van and shake my hand. I got glimpses of their paintings, either there or on the sidewalk, as some people managed to set up on their little tract of cement, rain or shine, the full 4 days. One time, the passenger's side window of an ancient Vanagon rolled down, and a young, long-haired, bearded guy wrapped in a Flintstones blanket grinned and squinted as if he was confused by what day it was, and asked if we could maybe come back later. It turned out he was just sleeping off a shift as an overnight stalker at Safeway. He said it was very nice to meet me, and that he'd soon be bombarding me with questions about my work. "Colin's brilliant. He just dropped out of Yale," Nate said to me. "He makes these, And he put his hands together in various ways to get me to imagine something both square and round at the same time. Then he laughed and said, "I'll just let him show you." I was already exhausted from so much social interaction, but then Nate took me to Johnny Submarine, where the artists of Vermilion Common tended to congregate instead of the nicer coffee shop nearby. "Good people at the coffee shop," Nate said delicately, "but it became a matter of public bathroom grace." He waved to a couple of men in a chipped corner booth painted bright orange. They were deep in discussion about something, and seemed to be nursing identical sodas in styrofoam cups. I got a rundown of the other nearby public bathrooms I could feel good about using, too. Nate was a man who understood priorities. For showering, the only good option was a daily pass at the gym over on Ebbett. He asked me what my plans were for laying my head down long term, and I told him my grand scheme was to sleep in the van for a little while and then find a room somewhere, within walking distance, hopefully. He confirmed what I'd hoped, that there was kind of an informal registry one of the artists kept of people who were looking for places to stay. The bad news was that even though the colony gained and lost people all the time, there could be quite a wait for something decent sometimes. The area was easy prey for slumlords. Nate himself lived full-time in a little bachelor's hovel he'd retired to 3 blocks away. He wanted to see my work, and I guessed I was going to have to get used to spontaneous explanations of what I did, so I unlocked the van and dug out a few random things from 3 plastic totes in the back that clogged up most of the room. From what I gleaned of Nate's nature already, I expected him to be super diplomatic and polite about them. He looked at my paintings so methodically and respectfully that for a minute at least, I felt all my trepidation about the day fading away. He even made very specific comments about how one particular painting made him feel. It was one I had never been too sure about, of a giant field full of cows. One cow, that you were supposed to just barely notice, was headed off into the woods through a gap in the fence. "I wonder what he's going to think when he goes off that farm for the first time," Nate said. "I wonder what the first thing he sees that surprises him is going to be." Standing close to him on the sidewalk, I could hear that his breathing was raspy and he was getting tired. I had been wanting to soak up information so badly for the past hour that I suddenly felt bad about wearing him out, but I also felt the need to ask him about his own art sooner rather than later. In his van were about 15 watercolors, almost all cityscapes, with carefully rendered specifics on street signs and storefronts. The skies above the city, Cleveland, I assumed, were done in strange and really unpredictable colors. "Well, they aren't mine," Nate told me. "I don't have a lick of talent. They were done by my boy. I lost him pretty recently. He was 22. There are people on this earth who just don't seem to have any other settings other than helpful and cheerful. And even as Nate told me this, he was trying to keep smiling, as if trying to wordlessly express how blessed he felt for having those 22 years. He wanted to try to sell the paintings because his foster son, whose name was Terry, had dreams of becoming an artist, and it felt like the right thing to do. Nate had just retired from the State Board of Education, and he had the time and no particular other place to be. I told him I thought what he was doing was a great thing. I wonder what would have happened if this hadn't been the very first voice I'd heard after parking on Pound Street, and if I'd have even made it through that first night, or even through my first solitary meal at Johnny Submarine. Turkey and lettuce and tomato, water, and a sugar cookie. I brushed my teeth in the sink in their bathroom. I'd gotten the impression that Nate's examination of my brother's half-hearted van winterization efforts had left him less than impressed. So, lying down in the back of the heap that night, I had a sinking feeling on top of the 2 or 3 sinking feelings I'd already had. "Remember to always lock up, even if you go off somewhere for just a minute," Nate had told me. And lying in my fancy REI sleeping bag, I looked up at the window above my head and prepared for no sleep whatsoever. For a while, every single set of footsteps that passed by on the sidewalk, and there weren't that many, caused me to seriously tense up. Especially steps at that one point, around 11 o'clock, went by very slowly on the other side of the van, the street side, real close, way too close. Past midnight, an unbelievably boring cell phone conversation some woman was having nearby about her trust problems with her boyfriend performed the acoustic miracle of seeming to come from 3 different directions. To keep from going crazy, I listened to old songs on my phone I'd heard a million times before, but I only had enough battery to listen for half the night. I'd forgotten to ask Nate the best place to get a good free charge. It got down to 30 degrees that night, and the debate with myself about whether or not to get up and walk 3 blocks to the 24-hour diner to warm myself and use the bathroom raged inside my head for a full 45 minutes. I was scared to open the door and set foot outside in the city at night, but finally I caved and did it. It was 3:30 in the morning, and I trotted along the sidewalk fast, past the rows of artists in their vehicles who had somehow learned to sleep through the night, or who had been smart enough to find a roommate situation in the walk-ups all around me. I sat in the Lazy Q diner until 5:30, bleary-eyed, trying to stretch but failing, and because I couldn't just sit there and not spend anything, I wound up stress-eating all the cholesterol and fat there ever was. And when I got back inside the van and collapsed, I was so tired and sick feeling that sleep didn't so much carry me away as beat me into submission. And that was my first night in Vermilion Common.
Nadia's shopping and to-do list, March 8th. 1. Find laundromat, get quarters. 2. Shower options. 3. Hand sanitizer, spring water, fresh apples, powder, shampoo, Tide sticks. 4. Drop health insurance tier by May 1. 5. Find dentist. 6. Packing tape. 7. Leo postage money. 8. Paper map of city and bus/train. 9. Thrift store. Hat. Better laundry bag. 10. New palette knife. 11. Workshops in finding arts grants.
My first glimpse of Kent was the same one most everyone got. I was walking around getting a feel for the neighborhood, especially where the heck I was gonna buy actual vegetables. And he was sitting on the sidewalk, leaned back against the wall of an old insurance office that had closed years before, using his left foot to reach out and awkwardly adjust the dirty sneaker on his right one. A huge blanket was spread out beneath him. On it were laid out 30 or 40 used books he was selling, stuff he had salvaged here and there. Around the corner and down a long block was the eastern edge of Vermilion Common, which was anchored by a portrait artist named Mark Dogis, who walked dogs to make money and lived out of his Ford Transit. Kent looked up at me but didn't smile, just murmured the quietest response possible to my hello as I walked past. I stopped and read the titles of various paperbacks laid out just so on the blanket, and I asked him if he was part of Vermilion Commons, since it was a little strange to be so close yet so far away from everyone else. He said, "Well, they tolerate me." I picked up a copy of The Enchanted April and asked him how much it cost, and then my eyes went to a corner of the blanket where a few self-published looking books with similar covers were grouped together. Seeing my attention turn to them, he told me he'd written the books himself, and that was how I first learned his name. The titles seemed science fiction-y and the covers looked hand-drawn. I picked one up, thumbed through it a bit, and asked him a couple of questions about the neighborhood. All I'd ever need to know about Kent's outward personality was in those first responses. He was terse and just barely polite. I told him I had unofficially moved to Vermilion Common, and he simply said, "Yeah, it's cool." Then he stared off in the direction of Cross Street like he wasn't much interested in talking. Feeling a little ashamed as I put his novel down gently on the blanket again, I told him I wished I was more of a science fiction fan, and I paid for the novel I'd picked out. He didn't have any change, he said, and I said it was fine for him to keep the whole $3 and maybe I'd see him around again. He nodded at me, reminded me to also read Vera by the same author sometime, and resumed his watch of the street. As much as I got to know Kent, I never did ask his exact age, though he wasn't much older than I was. He was too thin, and his beard was never in good shape, and fully half the time he wore the same t-shirt under his thrift store jacket, a t-shirt that showed a map of Earthsea, the kingdom dreamed up by Ursula Le Guin. The last thing I did in his presence that first day was to make it clear I got the reference. And I really think if I hadn't said that, he might never have sought me out soon after, and we would only have a nodding acquaintance for the rest of my days. I wasn't really ready for that first Saturday, when, starting at about 10 a.m., people from the city and even the suburbs would start strolling the sidewalks of Vermilion Common, rain or shine, but only if the rain wasn't too wet. Some of the artists gathered at Johnny Submarine for their hideous egg and bacon sandwiches beforehand, and some tailgated a little with juice and coffee and donuts. A few were nice enough to call me over and put a powdered donut in my hand and ask me all kinds of questions about myself. And I learned about all the ways they'd figured out how to accept payment in the rare event someone actually bought something. I made a couple of clumsy attempts at configuring some hip new money app on my phone, but decided the odds of me botching something were much higher than the odds of making a sale that particular day. It was looking like there might be a little rain and the cold was holding on, so the mood was pretty subdued. Not much of a crowd was expected. I unfolded the beach chair that my brother had stolen from his job at Rehoboth when he was 18 and parked myself on the sidewalk, feeling pretty woeful about the feebleness of my art display and vowing to spend the week pimping it out like I was seeing others do very creatively, no matter how wretched their vehicles were. I had 4 mismatched thrift store easels, and the other 2 paintings that I set out I just let lean against the side of the van. I waved to Nate, setting up 30 feet away, and he waved back. He had his foster son's cityscapes neatly arranged, and had even built a little overhang off the roof of his van to keep the weather away. I had never done anything like this before, really. Maybe some things of mine would occasionally make it into local amateur group shows at the art center, occasionally, or hang forgotten on the wall at Lurker Coffee. When my friend Katie had yard sales to pay her rent, I had placed something I'd just finished among her LPs and board games and tablecloths after slapping a $10 price tag on it, but at the end of the day I'd just have to take it back again and put it into the closet. I spent one long night working on a WordPress site once, experimenting with all kinds of different fonts on the banner and excitedly uploading photos of my work. The site lasted about 2 months before I decided it was hopelessly Bush League. Every time the visitor count went up by 1 in the corner of the screen, I felt strange and a little embarrassed. So I didn't know what it was like to sit there for an extended period of time and have total strangers come by and look at my work. I had decided to go completely with the water gel paintings and leave everything else in the totes in the van. And that first Saturday went about as expected. I'd say I had about 20 browsers total before I packed it in at lunchtime. Half of them made haste for the next display after just a few seconds of looking pretty nonplussed at what they were seeing. One silver-haired gent in a puffy ski coat kneeled down to take a long look at Cat Meets Moon, and he asked what I called this technique of mine. I told him I didn't really have a name for it, which wasn't true, and he said, "Very interesting." And I was on top of the world, and then there was a weird long pause, and he finally straightened up and sneezed into a silk handkerchief, and then he said it again. Very interesting. And saying it a second time somehow told me that he actually couldn't care less, so I plummeted back to my lowly state as he walked off, never to be seen again. A young guy wearing a sweatshirt that said "Quit your job and go get high down by the river" gave Woman Below the Canal a really decent once-over, and remarked enthusiastically to his spacey girlfriend that he thought it was totally lemon. And she sort of agreed. As soon as they moved on, I tried to look up online what lemon meant in any other context but, well, citrus, but I came up totally empty, and to this day I haven't been able to find out exactly how satisfied that word was supposed to make me feel. It felt so good to leave the van behind at noon, to walk for a bag of trail mix from the 24-hour mini-mart that I kind of never seriously went back. From various spots around the common, I watched people pass by my paintings without much interest and stopping, while Nate offered to keep an eye out for possible purloiners. It was fun talking to Colin, the Yale dropout, about how he made his odd little bird sculptures from melted down pennies and nickels and dimes he mostly found on the street. He had been playing coy with his parents for 6 months about where he was and what he was doing, and was now just a year away from becoming eligible to start drawing from a trust fund, which he was going to use to go to Alaska and live off the grid. And I found Suzanne, who kept the Vermilion Common Housing Registry, which turned out to be 3 pages in a Mead notebook from Rite Aid. Suzanne once had a critically acclaimed and controversial solo show at Aquavella in Manhattan 35 years before, and had been written up extensively back then in magazines like Art in America. She was 72 now, 3 times divorced, completely potty-mouthed, and had hair almost down to her waist. At one point, I followed her up a staircase to the apartment she shared with a woman 40 years younger than her, so she could find the notebook and add me to the registry. Some kind of static anomaly was created by the carpet or the heating ducts or something, and strands of that frizzy hair rose magically and found their way into my mouth because I was following too closely. She turned and saw me trying to evade the strands and laughed heartily. Suzanne refused to allow a single hint of gray to alter her appearance and never ran short of red dye for that amazing cascade of hair. She told me more than once that she discovered there was great joy in staying vain. She jotted my name and phone number down in the notebook and told me I looked to be 6th in line for a potential room if I wanted to share with other artists. "Or you can do what I did when I first came here," she told me, cackling gleefully. "Start an affair with one mostly to use her shower." I took down all my easels at 4 and climbed into the back of the van and napped in my sleeping bag, happy to think that when I woke up, it would be dark and the day would be behind me. I knew that I had to get better at this whole thing, whatever this whole thing was. I knew from YouTube videos that come springtime, Vermilion Common would get somewhat crowded on nice warm days, and I had to steel myself for what it would be like to have 200 people be unimpressed with my paintings weekend after weekend, not just a dozen or so. There was a cold snap that night, and after 2 uncomfortable hours in the van and some messy mental budgeting that tried to put the most positive possible spin on my finances, I kicked my sleeping bag off me and climbed behind the wheel. Over the sound of 5 pounds of pudding moving around inside a garbage bag, I drove, hating myself, to a Motel 6 between a Waffle House and a recycling center out in Lakewood, where I broke down and paid Saturday night rates to stay the night in a cruddy, non-smoking room where smoking clearly had been going on for decades. I stood under the harsh spray of hot water for a half hour and put some medical drama on the TV. Still not sleepy, I sketched the room on the reverse side of something I'd drawn a month before to save paper. As I finally lay down to sleep, I had a traumatic mental image of driving back to the Common at noon only to find someone had taken my perfect slot next to Nate, and I curled up and let the sound of young doctors and nurses getting into romantic entanglements play on, trying to dream only of how good the morning's complimentary lobby coffee might be if I had a little trail mix left to go with it. I slept in and left the motel at 10 with almost painful regret after taking another long shower. By 10:30, I was back in my spot on Pound Street, counting the cash I had on hand again, convinced according to the calculations I kept on the back of a takeout menu that I was somehow missing $10. I glanced out the windshield at one point to see Kent from the book blanket again. He was milling about on the sidewalk nearby, as if he were considering going in several different directions but had given up on all of them. I realized I had forgotten his name when I climbed out and said hello, but fortunately it never did come up. He was wearing the same clothes as 2 days before and looked like he had just woken up, like he always would. He said that Suzanne had come to him and mentioned I was trying to configure the latest confusing new payment app, and if I wanted, he could help. He'd done it for lots of other people. I thanked him, to which I got no response whatsoever, and went to dig out my phone while he shuffled awkwardly from foot to foot. Over the next few minutes, I watched as he not only got the payment app going, handing the phone back to me unsmiling when I needed to put the account info in, but made 2 other deep dive fixes to my phone settings, which according to him I desperately needed, or I may as well have been walking around with a telegraph machine instead. His fingers flew over the keypad like nothing I'd ever seen, faster than even a teenager. And of course, that's really saying something. He handed the phone back to me and asked me if I knew how to get into the gym for free for a month, and I said no, and very suddenly he said, "Come on." And just like that, he turned and headed down the sidewalk fast. I was kind of overwhelmed and started to follow without thinking when I forced myself to stop and speak up for myself a little. I told him to please wait while I got my coat from the van. With no reply, he did stop, rooting himself in place and looking a bit bored and put out. He had no coat himself. Kent's teachings on the ways of life within the borders of Vermilion Common were a lot different from Nate's, imparted mostly through comments and factoids tossed over his left shoulder as he walked ahead of me, not seeming to care much if I was able to keep up or not. At Flex on 7th Fitness, he stalked an employee named Manfred, who didn't seem all that happy to see him, and informed him without introductions that I was interested in a 21-day pass under the local resident deal. Manfred told us he could set it up this afternoon, but not right now, and I apologized for putting him out. Kent didn't feel the need to thank him or even truly resolve the conversation, and we were out of there almost as soon as we had entered. Kent assured me that there'd be no charge and that someone should have mentioned the deal to me by now, but probably didn't because they were walking around in a daze all the time. By they, he meant everyone in the Common. From there, it was over to Mike's Wings and Tenders, where Kent wanted to show me the condiment bar, which Mike, or the Mike entity, kept stocked in a way no chain restaurant ever dared to. There, Kent demonstrated, I could score almost unlimited packs of barbecue sauce, mayonnaise, ketchup, mustard, honey, and even saltines, which Kent practically lived on. All I had to do was buy a small drink or a small fries or something like he did, and then load up. Most of Kent's life tips involved some kind of small-time hustle, and he spoke with genuine pride about the ways he knew how to get something for nothing. As I followed him down the street towards the college book outlet, where we could apparently just walk away with 5 books a week legally and above board, I started to finally try to wedge in actual questions I had about the area, but more specifically about Kent himself. These he was clearly made uncomfortable by, but I was able to glean that he lived on what money he made with his book blanket, plus sometimes taking low-wage shifts using another miracle app that brought him day gigs as a dishwasher or warehouse worker. 2 days a week, no more. He didn't much read the books he sold on the blanket, but he did write 1 or 2 a year using computers at the library. It would be a few weeks before I learned what some of his short novels were really like through occasionally skimming the lightly discounted copies he sold me. The prose, I guess you'd call very basic, except once in a while Kent would totally shoot for the moon with a metaphor or bit of impressive vocabulary not heard in daily usage since about the 19th century. His 6-part Ocean of Bellows series was about the rise and fall of rival galactic empires and their war for the sun. The whole cycle brought in elements of fantasy, cyberpunk, the whole works. I think the number of giant-named space leeches in his fiction more than doubled the number of female characters. He'd been to college only very briefly, and he'd taught himself to write by reading authors stupid people don't even care about, in his words. Toward the end of our hour and a half together, he inadvertently intrigued me with his free rent situation. I kept asking more and more about it until he agreed to show me the building right around the corner from Packard Street, where he slept about 5 nights a week. The other 2 nights, he claimed he either crashed with friends or bunked at a shelter nearby that he insisted absolutely no one knew about, where he could get a huge breakfast and lunch, and they'd reserved a laptop for him in the staff office whenever he felt like using it. Beside a liquor store, there was a youth dance studio that hadn't survived. About half the letters etched into the glass of the front door were gone. Kent produced a key from his pocket to prove his claim that if he went up the interior steps beside the dance studio and down a hall where there used to be offices, there was a big utility room one of the artists from the Common had rented to him on the sly for $50 a month. At some point, that man had abruptly taken off because of a problem with his citizenship, and Kent had kept the key. In that time, Kent told me, defiantly, no one but him had ever gone in there, and nobody seemed to own or care about the building. Looking through the front door at the filthy, dark stairwell he mentioned, I could only imagine how bleak it must have been in there. He looked at me as if daring me to question his choice of residence, but I just told him he seemed very shrewd about life. I asked him if he liked the people on the Common, and when his answer was sort of non-committal, I asked why he had chosen to live among them, but not quite be part of them. He shrugged as he turned and began to walk again. "You have to live somewhere," he said, and that pretty much ended the topic. I had to get back to the van and hastily set up my display for the next day. I thanked him for his help as we got near it, and he said simply, "Doesn't put me out any." He headed back to his blanket on Varney Street, intending to stop first and gather his stock from someone he knew who lived down the block. He was limping just a little, which I would learn was due to getting his foot stuck in a hole on a construction site a few days before. His stride was impressively confident, though, as if he had somewhere very important to be. It would always be like that. Even when he was sick with yet another nagging cold, or coming off an exhausting 10-hour shift of hauling heavy pallets of Red Bull around a warehouse. The other interesting thing that happened on that Sunday, before another very quiet day of setting up my art only to have it mostly ignored, was that Nate had a message for me from someone. I had left one of my paintings with him because he'd offered to reframe it. That was something Nate really enjoyed doing. A businessman had been strolling around checking out almost everyone's work almost as soon as people had set up. And he'd spotted my painting lying against Nate's chair and asked him where the artist was. According to Nate, he'd really liked the style a lot and couldn't recall seeing it before and would have liked to talk with me about it. He said he'd be back. Nate thought he'd seen this man once before. "Businessman is the wrong word," he said. Are people still called preppies? That was more like it, real young. I spent that afternoon keeping a hopeful eye out for my admirer, this person who clearly must have been sent from the galleries of Paris to demand that I name any price whatsoever for my entire collection. But he never showed up, and I sold nothing, of course, and I knew it was only a matter of time before that condiment bar at Mike's Wings and Tenders was going to call out to me, especially the saltines. On the plus side, an almost completely deaf landscape painter named Chuck was passing out slices of a pizza he just baked in his little apartment on Thornton, and Nate and I each got one by being in the right place at the right time, and it was really, really good. Chuck told me all about his issues with store-bought mozzarella and his part-time job selling goat cheese. I had made it through half a week at Vermilion Common intact. Somehow, that night, I slept almost like I used to sleep for a good 7 or 8 hours, only waking up twice with street angst. In the morning, despite the usual grinding physical indignities that came up with using public bathrooms for almost everything, I was actually in an up mood. Suzanne had clued me into the presence, 2 bus lines away, of Newburgh Hall, a community arts center where you could set up an easel and a canvas and just go to town for hours without anyone batting an eye. That alone gave me reason to hope I could make some kind of life in the Common, at least for a few months. That was the first day I didn't come within a hair's breadth of driving the van all the way back home to my brother's house, utterly defeated. I was hungry and tired and perpetually grungy, but I was grateful to not be behind a counter processing some bitter person's cash refund that day or taking complaint calls in a creepily silent office. I vowed to stay out there next Sunday on that stupid sidewalk until the very last pedestrian of the day walked past my work and judged it to be completely average. Yeah, Kent's quite the jackass, Suzanne said to me as we sat cleaning brushes on the sidewalk on Wednesday afternoon, when the sun had broken through big time and gotten the temperature up to 60 degrees. She'd put on a huge orange sun hat that probably weighed more than she did. Her doctor was always telling her to eat more. He's gotten into a lot of arguments with the people here over some pretty silly things, she told me. God forbid anyone be allowed to have an opinion except Kent. So he stays off to himself. There's been no shortage of jackasses here, so it's nothing new. Suzanne herself seemed to be known to just about everybody in the Common, and it was rare that she was alone. Rumor had it that until pretty recently, she'd been the life of every party, even after 70, and didn't like staying home nights. I was astounded that her work had become so much different than the paintings of hers I'd researched in the back issues of art magazines at the college library the day before. She'd once specialized in very haunting portraits of street people, vagabonds, and especially the working poor. Her most famous show, I'd read, was of paintings showing forlorn, empty employee break rooms and grocery stores. That had been 44 years before. These days, she painted children mostly, and her color palette was only getting brighter, and she'd re-embraced the pure primary rainbow. She signed her paintings now with a different name than her own, something she'd playfully invented, craving anonymity. Drugs were the main thing that had cost her that promising career long ago. Her career and her first 2 marriages. Even before I got to know her well, she showed me the permanent discoloration on her left arm where injecting heroin had caused long-term circulation damage. She'd joined Narcotics Anonymous when she was 35 and had stayed off everything heavier than marijuana for 25 years. Then, on her 65th birthday, she told me she'd slipped. While most of her friends were getting 10% discounts at Denny's through their AARP memberships, she was going back into rehab. She'd been clean now for almost 7 years. I will say it was the craziest 65th birthday anyone ever had outside of Caligula or somebody, she once said to me. It was Suzanne who told me that heroin was what had killed Nate's foster son Terry. It had been an overdose, 2 days after Thanksgiving, 2021. She loved to gossip about people in the Common and could be really catty, but like most everyone else, she had a soft spot for Nate. I felt sisterly enough with her on that Wednesday afternoon, not even a week after meeting her for the first time, to ask her if she ever intended to draw him into her sinister web and get married again. "Oh, poor Nate," she replied with her infectious cackle. "That man just will not come out of the closet. He's really cozy in there, I think." She asked me if Kent was my type, if I liked the brooding bastards like she used to, the Mr. Rochesters of the world, but any personal talk like that has always made me blush horrifically and clam up. She patted my hand and let it go. "All I can say is, if someone is still lashing out after 25, steer right clear," she said. "But I think Kent is on and off some medications, so I shouldn't judge." Suzanne tirelessly asked everything about me that could possibly be asked, and informed me that she was legally obligated to blather about it all to anyone else who might want to know. She taught me about the intricacies of fan brushes and demanded to see everything I painted, getting more technical with her advice than I could even follow. She gave me a standing invitation to come to her place anytime to learn how to play backgammon, her favorite game. She proudly bragged that she'd once beaten Andres Serrano, a name I was flattered she thought I knew. Talking to the people around me on the block was saving me from the kind of distressing boredom I hadn't expected or been ready for. Constant worries of having to sleep in the van for longer than I thought, the effort to keep my diet into something recognizably human, and of course money issues had all made painting an afterthought for now, and without a job, the days were looking like long ones. I could only rearrange stuff in the van and do meaningless sketches for so long, but I had vowed not to fall into a job for now, to keep every day totally something I made myself, not something I was allowed, just a part of. I realized I had already learned more names of more new people than I would have in 3 years back home, and when that wasn't stressing me out, it was actually keeping me sane and making me feel like I was maybe finally starting to leave painfully shy Nadia behind in a way that working retail hadn't quite accomplished. I think I may have opened up a little too much there with Suzanne on the sidewalk that day, and probably inquired a bit too much about the crime rates in the area, because after a long silence, she clapped her hands and decided we were packing up and heading to her place to show me something. It was only half a block away. She and her roommate were on the second floor of a crumbling walk-up. Inside, the place was a congenial mess, looking more like my dorm at Franklin and Marshall than someplace a 72-year-old got her Social Security checks. Suzanne knocked on a bedroom door and introduced me to Kara, age 30, a quiet, serious-minded line cook at the nearby Buffalo Wild Wings. She'd obviously just woken up, though it was 1 p.m. Suzanne asked Kara if the plan they once had to rent out the hall closet was still in play. I figured the phrase hall closet was an exaggeration, but I was about to find out otherwise. Kara shook my hand, shrugged, and said, "Sure," obviously not caring much one way or the other. Suzanne explained to her that I was going to be a millionaire artist shortly, but first I had to survive the end of winter, and she could vouch that I was going to bring neither alcohol nor stray men into the apartment. Yes, it literally was the hallway closet Suzanne was talking about, though it was kind of an anomaly, almost a walk-in, as if the architect had forgotten something like that should go in a bedroom instead. "Before you say no to this charmer," she said, "know that it's even got an electrical outlet, and you picked the dumbest time in the world to come and try to live in that van." As master of the wonky housing sign-up sheet for the last year, she'd learned a few things, and there was no guarantee I'd find a room in my price range for a while. This was all too much to decide on fast, so I asked her if I could get back to her on it, but she wouldn't let me stall. She spun around cheerfully inside the perfect square, arms outstretched, sun hat hiding everything about her face except her smile. I vowed, in that moment, to be just as much fun somehow when I hit 72. And 20 minutes later, after sharing maybe a dozen more words with Kara, who'd actually had some bad luck renting to unstable artists in the past, I was an unofficial, and I guess illegal, resident of 121A Thornton Street for as long as I needed, with no obligation to stay a day longer. That made the place 66% filled with artists. Kara, who I never saw go out unless it was for work, had about as much interest in the world of painting as I had in Kent's space leeches. I felt a lot of guilt that first night as I locked the van and followed Suzanne with my backpack up the stairs again, because I couldn't not think of Kent's solitary trudge up his own set of stairs to a room I knew was so much lonelier. It had to be. That night, Suzanne and I talked until 2 a.m. about her long-ago education and LSD experiments at the Rhode Island School of Design, occasionally hauling our laundry up and down 2 flights of stairs to and from the basement, and I went to sleep warm and safe. Upon hearing about my new situation the next day, Nate spontaneously presented me with one of his foster son's less polished but more cheerful watercolors as a housewarming gift. It showed a drive-in theater on the edge of the Cleveland suburbs on a busy weekend night. I told him I'd treasure it and taped it carefully to one of my little walls.
Nadia's shopping and to-do list, March 16th. 1. Extension cord. 2. Hangers. 3. Back exercises. 4. Ask Kent about signing up for sleep study, parentheses $400. 5. Ask Kent about Park Pass. 6. Free days at Art Neo, 4th Fridays all summer. 7. Find Suzanne's artist statement, 1990.
No shortage of jackasses was a fair description of Vermilion Common, I guess, even though I'm happy to romanticize them all away when I think about the place now. You had the purists like Mark Dogis, who believed that anyone who didn't live in their car throughout their month or season or year at the Common was not being true to the community's underdog spirit. To the purists, sharing a rundown apartment with 3 other people was highfalutin luxury. I definitely felt I should move the van over to 16th Avenue to make room for someone else more in need. You had the classic painter types who looked down on anyone who tried to sell handcrafts, though handcraft folks were very few, it being understood that the Common was kind of a painter's place, though it hadn't been legislated or anything. Then you had the people who weren't very nice, or who cut themselves off from the very cheery socialist vibe that ran up and down Pound Street, with everyone sharing what they had. Sometimes the reason the unpleasant people were there on the block was because they had a little bit of talent but a lot of problems interacting socially. A few were on bad terms with their families, a few were running from debt collectors. These were the people living in the buildings and operating the storefronts across the sidewalk tended to complain about. I learned that there was a divide between the residents who fought against any attempt to publicize the Common, even allow it to be marketed a little by the city, and the artists who wouldn't mind a few cheesy banners put up on the sidewalks now and then if it meant increasing the chances of a sale. Chuck, he of landscapes and homemade pizza slices, told me he worried that if just one person made it big, even locally, it would change everything. But that just hadn't happened in the few years the Common had existed. Sales were very few, like at any community arts collective, and it was tough to make even a part-time living doing what they did. Most of the cars and vans sat empty most of the week while their owners worked. Money problems aside, what the artists of the Common worried about mostly was the city listening to the concerns of the locals and finally revoking the parking allowances that the whole community relied on to exist. I went to find Kent again the second Saturday morning I was there, and there he was on his blanket, where he kept an impressively regular schedule, which he tended to break only when he had to snag another manual labor shift. He was writing longhand in a notebook, working on Volume 4 of the Ocean of Bellows series. I told him I was suddenly flush with cash, which wasn't true at all, but my brother Leo had emailed me an IHOP gift card someone had given him at work and he'd forgotten about for 6 months, and I wasn't sure when Kent had ever had a real meal. He reluctantly and almost suspiciously agreed to join me, only after I assured him I'd get him back to the blanket way before noon, because he said he had a lot of work to do. I was already going to be late setting up my display for the day, but I didn't tell him this. He gathered the few dozen books he had for sale, dumped them into a gym bag as big as I was, scrunched the blanket into it, and walked to the bus stop with me. I had assumed he'd wanted to drop his setup back at his hovel, but no, he intended to carry it with him, struggling under the weight. Somehow, I couldn't bring myself to tell him I'd found a living arrangement, so we talked a little about the plot of his book, which sounded very confusing. I really wanted to know more about his life before he'd come to the Common, but all I could really glean was that he'd grown up just 20 miles away in Strongsville and hadn't really ever been anywhere else. The silences between us were a little uncomfortable. He wasn't one to ask a lot of personal questions. He was the kind of person who only really seemed to open up if you could get him going on his opinions or his grievances. I don't think he was used to someone offering him something for nothing, and at IHOP he seemed to be trying to spend as little of my gift card as he could. It warmed me to him a little, seeing this tiny display of humility. I hounded him into getting the triple stack of pancakes, scrambled eggs, and hash browns. We sat at the counter, and he told me all about how much money I could get if I sold my plasma to a place nearby, and showed me the card the city had issued him so he could ride the buses for free. I shifted the talk into the books we'd read in high school, which I tend to reminisce about quite a bit. He spoke about authors very knowledgeably, and managed to change my mind about a couple of them in the space of about 10 minutes. When it came to art, though, he was a little defensive about his lack of experience or interest in it. He asked me almost no questions about my past or my present. His impatience with the waiter's inability to refill his coffee cup about 12 times a minute was aggravating to me, and as usual, the word thanks had some difficulty escaping his mouth. I saw him smile just a little for the first time ever when I teased him about a renegade lock of hair over his right ear that he couldn't keep from poofing out. When we got off the bus back on 16th, he went back to set up his blanket again and said maybe he'd see me next week. But several hours later, in the middle of a busier Saturday on Pound Street, he appeared, coming up around the corner. I'd just had my heart broken by someone who really seemed to be debating over whether to buy something of mine, but, of course, had merely slunk away with an apologetic smile. I was obviously a terrible judge about people's real feelings toward my stuff, and had pretty much resigned myself to budgeting for maybe 3 sales a month, hinging, of course, on getting that very first one. I had my big easel set up right there on the sidewalk because I'd been told if you were actually painting something, you'd get more browsers. And Kent came up and gave me a subdued hi and just lingered, watching what I was doing. I was not quite halfway through an idea I'd had the night before. I was trying to replicate an image I'd once seen on a farm when my parents took me and Leo to Pennsylvania Dutch country for the first time. I found it kind of tough to paint in the chilly weather and was layered up enough to feel the effect it had on my brushstrokes. Kent sat right down, cross-legged on the cold sidewalk, and turned his face to the gray sky. For a time, he just watched me paint without saying much, his day on the book blanket apparently having wrapped up a bit early. Once in a while, someone I'd met would pass by and say hi, and certain people Kent knew got a nod or a low-key wave back from him. Frank Lemessier, whose paintings were some of the most disturbing I'd ever seen, passed by with a baguette sticking out of a bag and cheerfully offered some to us. Frank wouldn't hurt a fly, but he had no problem depicting fields of giant weeping flowers with sharp fangs, or the agonies of tormented souls wandering hell. I looked back over my shoulder at one point when I realized Kent hadn't made a sound in several minutes. I thought maybe he just drifted away again, but he was staring at my canvas as I worked carefully on the shading of a pond bank. He said to me, "Everything looks like it's made out of water." And I nodded and said, yeah, it was true. After a long pause, he finally asked me the first and only real question he would ever ask me about my work. How come? That was kind of a tough question to answer, but I explained to him it was a style I'd been working on for about a year. I liked the way it made all solid things seem completely impermanent instead, even the land. I liked to even bleed objects into one another with small watery intersections you had to look closely to see. I'm not sure why I developed this notion or where it was leading, but I liked to see how the world looked so different when I tried it, kind of elusive but wondrous too. I'd hear a variant of the phrase, "everything looks like it's made out of water," about once a day on the weekends at the Common. Kent had no further comment or opinion about what I was doing, but he did keep watching as I filled things in. I chanced at one point to verbally explain the steps of how I tried to apply the water gel technique to, say, a farmhouse in the distance as I went at it with russet and citrine, screwing up a little. He listened and seemed to absorb it well. It made me feel good that he seemed content to just be there on the sidewalk as I worked. The moment was broken when Benny came along. Benny, who could be a bit difficult to deal with, but was also thought of fondly by a lot of the people in the common. As soon as Benny came down the sidewalk in his usual stained blue sport coat and black corduroys, sketch pad in hand, Kent got aggravated and my captive audience pretty much dissolved. It was time for me to finally succumb to being sketched by Benny, as we all did at some point or another. Benny was 20 and lived nearby with his parents, and hung around the common quite a bit. He was Japanese, and his very traditional folks were apparently baffled and embarrassed by what their son had grown into. He didn't work, and they grudgingly supported him. We all thought it was likely they refused to accept their son might well be on the autistic spectrum, and instead thought he was lazy and unfocused. He walked around the city much of the day with his sketch pad, offering to draw people for free, honestly not expecting any compensation for his work. He actually did have some artistic flair, and I saw his pencil portraits affixed to the refrigerators of a couple of people living in the common. Suzanne had framed hers. Benny's hair was always a mess, and direct eye contact seemed to really unsettle him, so the strangers he approached often thought he was homeless or just a pest. But he wanted nothing but 10 minutes of their time, so he could do the thing he liked to do best. He didn't think of himself as a true artist. He just wanted to keep getting a little better at his hobby and avoid putting in part-time job applications at restaurants or retail stores, where he said the work seemed much too hard for him. His face was completely cherubic, and I thought he was destined to always look much younger than his years. I'd excused myself from being sketched the first time he'd approached me because I'd been in the middle of a conversation, but this time I said it was fine, as long as I could keep working myself. Kent took a copy of In Cold Blood out of his jeans pocket and started reading. Benny stood on the sidewalk and did his thing, sometimes asking me polite and very random personal questions in such an awkward way. It was as if he had been sternly coached to do it or read it in a self-help book that it was a polite thing to do. I thought Benny must have been very lonely, and could imagine him sitting alone at a cafeteria table back in high school, if he'd even made it that far, maybe dressed in that very same aging sport coat and mismatched corduroys, wondering what all the other kids were doing that weekend. I insisted he take $5 for the sidewalk sketch he did of me with his aging No. 2 Ticonderoga pencil. He was definitely shaky with noses, but overall the sketch was not bad at all, and I really liked his delicacy with shadows. I told him I hoped he'd go to college someday and study art, but he said he wasn't very good at school and found actual paint to be confusing to work with. He didn't sign his sketch, but numbered it instead. He kept track in his mind of how many he'd done. I was number 65. He was about to leave me and head off to wherever he spent Saturday afternoons, the library mostly, or a grungy arcade, when a man excused himself for interrupting, having been pointed toward me by Nate. He said his name was Tom Hamblin, and he'd been here the week before. He was just about 30, and so neat and clean-cut it made me wonder just what they were doing with shaving and trimming technology these days. His clothes looked kind of expensive. I shook his hand and told him I'd be happy to show him any of the paintings he may have wanted to look at. Kent, hearing this, rose off the sidewalk, turned, and started walking back toward Varney Street. Benny had irritated him, but the presence of Tom Hamblin sent him off brusquely without a word of goodbye. If he did hear me call out that I'd see him later, he didn't give any indication of it. I think I may have been quaking a little when I opened the van and furiously dug into the 2 totes where most of my stuff was buried, but in particular Tom wanted to take another look at one called Green Walls on a Red Morning. That one happened to be leaning against the interior panel, having gotten rotated out of my sidewalk display for the moment. I handed it to him and he squinted at it in the sun, taking the details in. It was the water technique that had drawn him, he told me, and he named a couple of not terribly famous painters whose work it reminded him of, and that widened my eyes some. Tom worked for his father at the Four Saints Gallery in University Circle. It was one of the more established galleries in the city. He told me he'd begun to come to Vermilion Common on weekends when the board had started to encourage going out wider into the community after 2 decades of towing the usual insular line of the established art world. Tom was responsible for curating a group show in early autumn, and he was trying to push the idea of making it all entirely dedicated to unshown artists. The little self-marketing twerp inside me came out, and I tried to keep him talking about art and wound up repeating what I'd told Kent about my technique, only clumsier and using terms I usually rolled my eyes at. But Tom nodded and smiled a lot and seemed to be a genuinely nice guy. He asked me if I had any prints for sale of the painting he currently held in his hand, but I had to tell him no. I hadn't prepared very well for my arrival in the Common, and he asked me questions about how I'd gotten set up here and how long I planned to stay. He gave me his card and told me that when I had prints made, he wanted to buy one of Green Walls and a Red Morning, and I should also send him a link to my online gallery, which of course I pretended was just hours away from being finalized. He walked away, cueing his key fob at a shiny Volvo unlocked across the street. I put the painting back on its tote and cursed myself for dragging my feet on the prints thing, and for hosting my dinky online gallery with a web service that most people thought had folded back in the 90s. That night, there was a knock on the apartment door as I was rearranging the closet for the 3rd time, trying to find a way to avoid the unhealthy curl my upper body would have to adopt every night if I wanted to fit a folding card table in there to use as a crude desk. It was Colin Chickwood out in the hall wearing his Yale sweatshirt. He wanted to let me and Suzanne know that this was the night the International Space Station could supposedly be seen with the naked eye, and the big moment over Cleveland was only about 45 minutes away. He and Nate and Mark Doges were headed across the train tracks to see it. Suzanne had been very tired recently and was in bed by 9 some nights, but I joined them, and so did 2 other artists. And Benny came out with us too. It happened that he was still out on Thornton Street at 8:30, haunting Night Cat used books and records. He knew all about the International Space Station and kept saying, "Ah!" at the realization he might actually see it. Together, we all tramped, shivering, a half-mile north through a train yard to the most open tract of land around, a sad and desolate stretch of weeds and scrubland and broken cement where a factory used to be. Mark had the biggest thermos of hot coffee I'd ever seen, and he kept offering it to everyone. But he'd made it so hot it kept sending people's mouths into shock. Benny advised us all against sipping from the same container and listed some illnesses we could possibly get from it. I hopped from foot to foot, shivering, thanking God I wasn't sleeping in the van that night. Colin's father, who he was often estranged from, was a professor of physics, and he guided Colin over the phone to the point in the sky we should watch for. The group must have looked pretty hysterical, turning around and around like drunks, trying to get the celestial landmarks right. The exact moment was approaching fast. And then, there it was. Or at least, we thought so, because it was only a tiny speck of pure white light that simply seemed more steady and consistent than the others in the sky around it. And if we stared and cleared our minds and our senses, we could maybe detect that it was moving. "Yup, that's it!" Colin shouted to us, phone pressed against his ear, and we all fell silent for a few seconds. A few seconds was all we got before the ISS was invisible again, moving ever forward on its grand cosmic adventure. "People up there, how about that?" I said to Benny, who was the last of us to stand rooted in place trying to keep seeing that gleaming speck. So far, he replied in wonder. And then we were all headed back to the Common, laughing and trotting before another wind gust picked up and slapped us silly. And that's the purest, happiest memory I have of that whole year.
Leo's shopping list, April 3rd. Chunky soup, masking tape, gum, D12 supplement, Tostitos. Nadia B Day, paint stuff, portable DVD player, ? Office Depot gift card, ? Walgreens, ? Cart with wheels, ?
There was no way I could have gotten through those first 2 months without unexpectedly getting to know so many people, or the Sunday calls from my brother. From Monday to Thursday, when I wasn't painting at Newburgh Hall, I sometimes went on errands with a few of the artists, or went to a gallery or two with them. Mostly, it was just a lot of us dragging laundry in 2s or 3s to the Cleanorama, or walking over to the Asian market on 14th. Frank Lemessier led an instructional meetup every Tuesday morning, sticking to mostly non-terrifying imagery, and that became a group breakfast, too. The blocks comprising the Common felt a little quiet and cheerless during the week, though, as people went off to work or napped in their vans. Outside of my roommates, Suzanne and Kara, I guess I did spend the most time with Kent. I'd make a point on Wednesdays or Thursdays to swing by his book blanket and chat. He was definitely disappointed when I told him I'd moved off the street and into a closet, and he stopped teaching me about economic schemes real quick, as if I had suddenly become one of the 1% and wouldn't even stoop to picking a $50 bill off the street. Money was something we never talked about after that. It was tough to describe to someone in his bleak situation how worried I was that what little I had was running out faster than I thought it would, or how confused I was about the discount health insurance I'd just signed up for. A part-time job was definitely on the horizon, but I was still making myself wait, wanting so badly to hold on to that feeling of being so free. I'd try to get Kent up and moving, take a walk down to the waterfront and back. He wasn't much interested in the goings-on at the Commons, so we talked about books and movies, and a couple of times we took a detour into the Cuyahoga Community College library and drifted through the stacks. He would roam the science fiction collection, but he was also very into the history of Rome and the invasions of Britannia, and he liked to pore over scholarly journals, bursting with dry film analysis, too. Once or twice I spotted the library's markings on a book Kent was selling on his blanket, and I thought it was best not to go down the road of asking what was up with that. Cuyahoga was the school he'd dropped out of 7 years before. No matter what he said to the contrary, it must have felt a little painful for him to be among those stacks. The reason for his dropping out was, he claimed, because he'd realized the folly and corruption of the college system immediately. I suspected that if someone made him take an IQ test, he'd rank pretty far up there, but of course that doesn't count for much in the real world. He told me he'd get a real job and an apartment once he felt like it, and definitely not until the Ocean of Bellows series had resolved itself. He had 3 or 4 novels to go, so maybe another 4 years. The longest he'd ever worked in one place was at the gift shop at the Museum of Natural History, 8 months. When his roommate had bailed on him back then, he realized he was fed up with everything and chose the blanket, trying to make it seem, to me, like a perfectly natural transition. There were long stretches of his past that he stayed cagey about, revealing very little. He'd last talked to his family a couple of years before, at his grandmother's funeral. Kent lived in a world that was all about himself, every day in and day out. I could count on one hand the number of times he asked me something about myself that didn't affect him directly. The reason I'd come to Vermilion Common didn't seem to matter much to him. Almost no one lasts more than a couple of weeks, he told me, which felt inaccurate. I considered it was an amazing victory when he started actively seeking me out, maybe once a week, never wanting to come upstairs to see the apartment. Always waiting out on the sidewalk. These visits usually began with the phrase, "I was going to Johnny Submarine anyway," as if it was to be understood that I wasn't much more than an afterthought. He'd pull a crumpled $5 bill from an old Velcro wallet and buy a soda, or maybe also some onion rings, and I learned quickly that to offer to buy him more would go absolutely nowhere. The IHOP gift card was the last free ride he intended to take from me. He'd sit in the booth and wait for me to bring something up to talk about, then after 15 minutes of chat he'd say, "I gotta go," with the excuse not sounding terribly convincing. By the time spring really took hold, he had surely convinced me of one thing, which was his dedication to his own art. It was partially why I could tolerate the distant and indifferent way he approached life and people. Notebook after notebook, filled up beside him on his blanket over the days, then weeks. He'd spend whole weekends transcribing them at the library, revising as he went. There, he'd also check to see if he had any sales from the Amazon listings of the self-published novels. I'd ask him how those were doing, and he'd just laugh bitterly and say something like, "I sold 2 last month, you want to go to Tahiti?" I visualized him being mostly isolated for the next several years as he completed his grand space epic, and wondered how much more gray his beard would get in that time. He was already showing just a little of it if you looked close on a day when he'd really let himself go, and I guess that this was probably the first year that this sign of getting older had touched him. Mysteriously, one day, out of nowhere, he started shaving fairly regularly, and I wondered if the gray had maybe just scared him, if the sight made him have to look too hard at himself and where he was. Weekends at the Common got busier. I did get my prints made, and I sold enough of them from the van to sustain my spirit, though it didn't do a whole lot for my bank account. I even sent an email to Tom Hamblin to prod his memory about his interest in buying one, and I heard right back from him. He was on vacation, but he said he'd come by the Common soon enough. I started to get better at smiling at the weekend browsers and spotting the very few who were genuinely interested in something they were looking at. There were even weekend regulars, mostly young people from downtown, which was going through an explosion of gentrification. I think most of them were quietly disappointed there were no food trucks at Vermilion Common. By April, I was pretty much an expert at the polite smile, and I started to feel nothing at all when someone walked away empty-handed, no worse about the work I was doing. I never liked anything more than when foot traffic really thinned out and one of the other artists would wander over to gossip or complain or even offer a few supportive words. One incident that really stuck with me was a time a real quiet girl, younger than even me, drove in from somewhere unknown to show her cool watercolors of oddly shaped goldfish swimming in truly giant bowls. In the middle of a typical Saturday, she suddenly slammed her easels angrily into her van, crying as a baffled browser asked her what she'd said to make her so mad. The girl wouldn't answer and drove off 10 minutes later and never came back, ending her 10 days or so in the Common. I heard from other artists later that she had been very thin-skinned and took every criticism destructively hard, no matter who it was from. I've always wondered what happened to her. The various little stresses caused me continued trouble sleeping through the night. I spent a lot of time there in the closet looking at my Parisian skyline nightlight and wondering why I wasn't so much happier, since so many things had fallen into place so fast for me. Every morning when I woke up and every night when I climbed into the sleeping bag, I was grateful to be out on my own for the first time and safe and somehow liked. And those first moments of taking out the sketch pad or mixing my oils each day felt like bliss, since I felt a million miles away from the bookstore where I'd last drawn a real paycheck. But it all still felt like so much sensory input, too much uncertainty after growing up so used to an unchallenging suburban routine. I would put my brush down in the middle of painting and think about my room back at my brother's, the place that was so familiar to me, missing the boring, simple things whose comforting sameness I'd taken for granted. There was no real reason I couldn't drive back home for a couple of days here and there, except I really worried I'd never want to come back to the city. I wanted so much to be able to say to people someday, I spent a whole summer trying to live the life. I wondered whether I wanted to say that more than I actually wanted to make a breakthrough with my actual work. And then the imposter syndrome would creep in and another hour would drag by in the closet or on the sofa on Thornton Street. I didn't talk about those feelings with Suzanne or anybody else. I tried to set myself up for keeping busy for the long haul and to push myself to evolve my water gel paintings in different directions. Though the more I stared into them, the more uncertain I was myself about what I was going for.
Leo.
Nadia was standing in line at Johnny's Submarine one Sunday in May, just before the day really began, intending to cash in her 5th loyalty card punch to get a free cookie, when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, and Tom Hamblin was standing there, looking a little bashful. He introduced himself to her all over again. which wasn't totally necessary. He'd come back to Vermilion Common for another stroll of the displays, and also to pick up the print of Nadia's that he'd been interested in. He'd spotted her through the front window, but laughed as he told her that he probably would have wound up in Johnny's submarine anyway, having gotten hooked on their onion rings on his first visit to the Common. Nadia told me she got an immediate mental image of the industrial grease that held those monstrosities together, getting on his nice clothes, and shuddered inside. Well, there was no way she was going to dawdle at the counter when there was money to be made, of course, so she hustled them out of there, and they walked toward the van, which had been moved once again to a tight spot on Thornton beside a husband and wife team of painters who lived half the time outside the city at a campground. She said Tom was very chatty about inconsequential things like the gorgeous weather and all the construction that seemed to be coming into the area. She told me he struck her then as the kind of guy who always said good morning to everyone where he worked, even when he got nothing back. She asked him about the goings-on at Four Saints, and he told her about a recent exhibition which had wound up selling almost nothing and gotten everyone a little worried about the rest of the year. She knew about that show, but didn't say anything. Her friend Suzanne had gone on opening night, and had told her the stuff was surprisingly weak. Tom told her his job had been just plain physical recently, as he tended to pitch in a lot with the hanging, moving, and storage work between shows. What Nadia was really after, self-servedly, was some inkling that they might be looking to hire for whatever reason. But she explained to me that even a gallery as nice as Four Saints tended to run on a shoestring. He asked to see some of the other water gel paintings, and he spent so long looking at them in silence that 2 browsers came and went in that time. Finally, when he had bought 2 prints and tucked them under his arm, the only ones Nadia would sell that entire weekend, it turned out, he told her he had a bit of potentially good news for her. There were still spots in the autumn show whose curation he was partly responsible for, the part that focused on local talent. With her permission, he wanted to present a few of her water gel paintings to the board for review, and just maybe there was a chance they'd like them enough to feature one. No guarantees or anything, but he thought there was something in her style they'd maybe not quite seen before. Nadia recalled stuttering out a word that sounded like absolutely, but who really knew? She was so close to bursting that a couple of extra syllables may have gotten in there. "Yeah," he said, "I just really like it. It makes the world look..." He shrugged and laughed, a bit embarrassed that he couldn't come up with the perfect compliment. It was obvious to her that Tom had something else on his mind, and his physical act of turning to leave was like watching someone get confused on stage in a high school play and blow their exit while the audience put their hands over their faces. Standing a full car length away from her, he asked Nadia if she maybe wanted to get some food next Friday night when he was back on this side of town. Nothing fancy, just hang out, talk about art, stuff like that. She felt her face going a little red. She told him that on Friday there was a potluck being put on by her friend Nate, and she would be helping out with that. "Is that the nice guy over there with the city paintings, the one who first pointed me over to you?" Tom asked. And she told him the paintings had been done by his late foster son, a fact he didn't really need to know just then, and which made the moment even a little more stilted when he absorbed that fact. She suggested to him that he come to the potluck. He could meet a lot of people from the Common, and if he wanted, he didn't even have to tell them he worked for a gallery. Tom replied that that was a good idea. He hadn't told anyone else that. Nadia felt flattered again, but still a bit cornered, and she retreated to some kind of conversational autopilot feature. Tom accepted her invitation. She told him to dress real casual, since everyone else who would be there was virtually in sweatpants all day. He took 3 steps forward and shook her hand and thanked her for the prints, then waved and walked off. She told me she wondered if he'd been working long enough with artists to know what a little sliver of hope like the one he'd offered did to their thoughts. and how precarious was the mental ledge a lot of them walked. She hoped he did.
The potluck was something Nate had often wondered why we all didn't do more of. The idea kind of wigged me out, only because I had nightmares about people taking one look at my scalloped potatoes and moving right past them, hoping I wouldn't be offended by their disinterest. It would be a total microcosm of the experience of a typical weekend at the Common. I was a bit stressed as I hauled my dish over to Nate's immaculate little one-bedroom apartment, facing, as I was, the prospect of being around a lot of people at once yet again, and the giant bonus of an awkward date/non-date situation piled on top of it. No one in history ever went to more of an effort to make people feel casual and cozy than Nate Weaver, though. Knowing him, I think he may have even intentionally untidied key spots in his place so that everyone would feel more comfortable. It wound up being a total of 15 people that night, pushing the limits of what the place could sit. And without a real dining table, there was a lot of ottomans sitting and balancing on the arm of a single sofa. Suzanne, who did yoga daily, sat on the floor much of the time, picking idly at salad and bread. My potatoes went over just well enough to the point where I could forget about them. I had prayed for a 50% scoop out of the tray they sat in, and that is just what I got. It started out being a very gossipy evening, with a lot of the talk being about the city's resurrection of the development plan for the entire area that held Vermilion Common. By the time Tom Hamblin arrived, running a bit late from his work at the gallery, everyone had thankfully moved on to 2 or 3 different conversations about everyday things. TV shows, the job market in the area, which cell phone companies were the biggest crooks, and of course, how to keep vans cool at night during summer. Tom dove into the food with genuine excitement and heaped a ton of it onto his plate, explaining that he didn't have time to cook much. He waved hello to everyone and stood near Nate's artificial fireplace, plate perched on a rickety end table. We talked a bit about his recent move from one side of the city to the other, but very happily the conversational pressure was alleviated when a group of friendly people came up and introduced themselves to one or both of us. When they asked what Tom did, he said simply that currently he did a little work for the Four Saints Gallery, a harmless understatement he'd certainly spent some time phrasing in advance. I met David Roby that night, who'd caused a bit of a buzz when he'd arrived at the Common in a gleaming RV. I didn't follow football, so it had to be explained to me after the party that he'd been the second-string quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers for 3 forgettable years, and after getting cut, he'd come to the Common instead of trying to latch on with another team. He did these lovely, very small oil paintings of the Midwestern countryside, and he stayed for 2 months before he enrolled full-time at the Cleveland Institute of Art. And I talked a bit with a guy named Damaso Candelaria, who'd been at the Common almost from its beginning, living a few blocks away in his ex-wife's basement and making a pretty good living doing IT remotely. He knew Kent and asked me if I'd read his books, and I had to tell him, not completely. Science fiction just wasn't my thing. He said, "That's too bad. They're pretty amazing." He told me he doubted anyone would ever get how they retraced the history of the Peloponnesian Wars so cleverly, and with such direct parallels and metaphors. He thought he might be Kent's only real fan. "It's a shame," he said. "The series deserves to be published." Kent was there that night. Nate had invited him. He was one of the last people in, and when he appeared in the living room and offered a little wave, he didn't get much response. My eyes went right away to the odd shirt he was wearing, seeming so unlike him, a long-sleeved button-up that he practically floated in. It had a kind of silvery sheen to it that was almost distracting, in glaring contrast to his faded jeans with the hole in one knee. I suppose he'd gotten the shirt from a thrift store, or maybe he had it tucked away somewhere in case of a job interview or a funeral, or I guess a rare invitation to a social function like this one. He got a small plate of food and sat on the floor near Suzanne, who engaged him the little she could, while he was ignored by pretty much everyone else. I finally broke away from Tom and said hello. Kent looked about as uncomfortable as a person could, and made my own social squeamishness feel like small beans. He told me about the movie he'd gone to see that day, which he didn't think was anywhere near as good as anyone said. That was very much his usual line. people eventually began to head out. Tom excused himself very cheerfully, thanked me for the invitation, and gave a nice loud general goodbye to everyone before heading into the kitchen. There, he told me he was actually headed back to the gallery to finish up some work, though it was so late. As I walked him out of the hallway and toward the stairwell, he confessed he kind of liked putting in some hours there when his father wasn't around. Things had always been a little uneasy between them, back since Tom had set aside finishing law school to go into the family business, which was running Four Saints. "We just don't see eye to eye much," he told me. I asked him if he planned to stay there. He wasn't sure. Working for the gallery had a lot of problems, he said, but everything seemed so laid out for him. The next 5 years, the 5 years after that. The gallery wasn't guaranteed any kind of survival, but it felt like if he followed the plot set down for him, he himself would be okay. The family would make sure of it. It was kind of nice, he said, not to worry about the future in the same nail-biting way a lot of people he'd gone to school with did, but he didn't sound very convinced. He told me he'd let me know in the next couple of months about the status of the group show, and he might even get back to the Common before then, though he wasn't sure. He gave me a smile and a funny little salute as he headed down the stairs. I waited till I heard the front door of the building open and close, hearing a gust of wind swirl up and cloak Tom's footsteps as he went away. Then I went back into Nate's to help him and Suzanne clean up a bit, but he'd ordered Suzanne to lie down and rest to tend to her headache, so it was just him and me trying to do all those dishes in his awful little sink. "When did Kent leave?" I asked him, but he honestly didn't know. Suzanne and I left together at 11. I insisted she go back up to the apartment while I walked over to the pharmacy to pick up some aspirin for her. She fought me on it, but in the end she gave in, told me to be careful, and most importantly, always shoot to kill. I felt the need to walk to settle a bunch of nervous energy inside me, riled up by overload from the party, the stress of remembering new names, and Tom's visit. The pharmacy was only a block and a half from Kent's building, or should I say the building where Kent sometimes existed indoors. I decided to walk a bigger square than I'd planned and take a stroll past the place, hoping it wouldn't look too much sadder at night. Nearby was some gated and shuttered place called Shoe Pavilion, whose sign looked like it had been made sometime in the 1960s, and a rough-looking convenience store that would not only sell you cigarettes and chunky bars, but also make everything from a steak sub to Thai food. I peered through the glass door that Kent parted a couple times a day, and I could see in the dark the small square sign on which white plastic letters used to be arranged to spell out the names of the few offices beside the dance studio. The words Brentley Dental were still there, and that was it. I turned away and headed back to the apartment. I heard Kent's voice from behind me almost right away. He was coming out of the building. Now his shiny shirt was just a part of history, and he was wearing a sweatshirt he'd gotten for free for manning a marathon registration table a few weeks before. He asked me what was up, and came out onto the sidewalk. Either he was too embarrassed by his living space to invite me in, or it just wouldn't ever occur to him to make that kind of a gesture. He'd only arrived back at the place a few minutes before, he said. I thought maybe it had been longer than that, and he'd been sitting up above looking down at the street. I told him I'd just been out getting some stuff for Suzanne, and held up the bag from the pharmacy as proof. He did ask me if I wanted some cornbread, since Nate had given him a ton of it to take home, but I said no. We stood on the sidewalk and talked about the party a little, who he'd talked to, who he hadn't. I decided to tell him my very tiny hint of what might eventually turn into good news, which was that one of the people who he hadn't met, the guy Tom, who I'd been talking to a lot, was going to show some of my work to the owners of the gallery he worked at. Kent just nodded and asked if it was the water stuff I'd been working on. Then he shifted the talk to a laptop he'd fixed for a guy who worked at a coffee shop, and how he was now going to be given the guy's old one, absolutely free. I said to him, "You know, most people who do something artistic, they just want to hear some little word of encouragement. They're just hoping for one little seed sometime that means someone cares at all. Do you not need that?" I think he saw immediately that it was intended as a gentle criticism of his indifference to what I thought and did, which it was. He replied, "If you need that kind of thing, then you have to wonder, what's what we do all about, being accepted?" I said, "Maybe it is. What's so wrong with that?" Why do you have to reject everyone, or what you do isn't pure somehow? But he wasn't really having any of that. He said to me, if you took all the people who were just kind of working through an identity thing out of the common, there wouldn't be that many people left. They just keep coming and going. I just sit there, I watch them come and go. They leave as soon as this passion they keep talking about gets really hard. I hated him a little then. I asked him exactly what made a person qualify for the Kent Dooley Medal of Artistic Worthiness. If to pass the test they had to ignore their medical bills or their families or maybe even their kids too. If feeding themselves and feeding people who depended on them should be so much more important than words or paintings or music. He said, all I know is I don't want to do my stuff to feel like I'm in a tribe with people like me.
That felt so hurtful that Nadia was speechless for a moment. Telling that part of the story to me years later was the only time her old self, the one that hadn't gained all her confidence and perspective yet, came out again, shrinking her a little. I actually miss that old version of my sister sometimes. Then she finally told this guy that she just felt sad for him. She felt sad that he was someone who was just tolerated everywhere, never actually wanted, but he kept showing why. It wasn't some admirable artistic flame that kept him going, she told him. It was just a love for his own intellect because nobody else wanted to be near it. She was so affected she couldn't stop herself from turning away from him before she even finished her thought, and the final syllables may have fallen to the ground unheard. She walked away without even setting a direction, which did turn out to be the wrong one. And of course, she told me, there was no coming after her to apologize or make sure she was all right. He didn't call out from behind her. She was so sure he'd be gone when she finally got to the corner of the street that she turned and just looked at the spot where he'd been. And yes, he was gone, back inside his hovel. And she felt fairly certain that she'd lost him as a friend, if that was even the true word for what he had been. Considering who she felt she'd gained since March, it shouldn't have been such a hard blow, but she said it just was.
What I did not expect was for Kent to mysteriously vanish. 5 days after our fight, on a day when I took a paid week-long cat-sitting job for one of the artists, I went around to Varney Street to try to have another conversation with him and to tell him I'd be living across the train tracks in Central for a bit and maybe he could swing by and say hi at some point. But his book blanket wasn't there. And it wasn't there the next day either. I asked the 2 people at the Common who knew him best if they'd seen him, and neither of them had. It worried me a little. I still didn't really understand Kent's mind, and I didn't think it was totally out of the realm of possibility that he might just begin to avoid me in truly spectacular fashion, even changing his routine to do it. Based on his history of little tiffs, I assumed he must have gotten used to someone getting him with a jab to the ribs once in a while. Metaphorically and maybe even not metaphorically. So I tried to remember exactly what I'd said to him when I'd tried to cut him down. I wound up with some troubling information from Suzanne. It was a bright, sunny Saturday, and she and I were out on the sidewalk playing backgammon on a crate for a penny a point and rising occasionally to cater to the browsers, of which there must have been 300 between 11 and 4. She sold 4 of her blue orchid prints that day, and I sold a couple myself, and we were both feeling good about things. I'd finally gotten my displays up to par using 2 mounted and magnetized racks that adhered to the side of the van, like a lot of people had managed. Nate had cut and mounted them for free, but for weeks I'd been worried about investing in the materials. My space finally looked as acceptable as most everyone else's. There was something about the stout click as my painting settled into place on the racks that always lifted my spirits, and I got carried away and uploaded a photo of myself standing in front of the whole display to my dorky, inadequate website. "Get that serious look off your face, girl," Suzanne had scolded me just before we took the picture. "Who do you think you are, Virginia Woolf?" And I meekly obeyed. She was slapping my hand away from the doubling cube again to prevent me from making another dumb gamble so late in our game, and I mentioned my dust-up with Kent to her. She sighed and sorted through her memories for a bit. He did sometimes just up and go for a while, she said. It happened 2 or 3 times since she'd come to the area. Once for a few weeks, or maybe it had been even a month. He never explained himself, just said he had stuff to take care of, and he didn't like to answer a lot of questions about it. The last time it happened, Suzanne said, was sometime around Christmas of the previous year. When he'd come back, he went on as if nothing had ever been out of the ordinary. But there had been a day right after his reappearance when she saw he was wearing a light blue shirt over his natty black one, maybe just for a little extra warmth. That was a little out of the ordinary for him. It was just one time that he'd worn it and never again. And she thought she'd recognize the logo on its chest. Suzanne was about 90% sure it was the kind of t-shirt they issued patients at Ivy Behavioral Health Hospital. She'd worn one herself once for 3 weeks, she said. She'd thrown hers away the second they'd signed her out of the place for good, never wanting to think about that time again.
On the morning of Friday, June 13th, I got in my Mazda and started heading west on I-76 to Pittsburgh. From there, after lunch at Arby's, I took 80 and then 480 toward Cleveland. It rained almost the entire trip. I'd been a fool not to split it up into 2 days. Still, I got to Vermilion Common only an hour later than I thought I would. Nadia texted me and told me to meet her at a coffee house instead of coming by the van, since I wasn't going to be able to get any real sense of the place with the rain pounding us. That would maybe have to wait till later in the afternoon when it was supposed to clear up. So in I walked to see her sitting alone at a side table. And the Lancaster aristocracy was together once again, after months without any good teasing, any good water pranks, or even any flipping through the channels at night together when we got home from our jobs, too tired to argue over what movie to watch. She looked thin, not me thin, but like she hadn't been remembering to eat all the time. Aside from that, though, she seemed fine. I had her retell the stories of her nights in the van, which were both more dramatic and more funny in person than over the phone. I very much approved of the fact that the E-150 had at long last partially served the purpose it was bought for. I hung on every word as she talked about the spontaneous day trips or even just the errands her new friends had talked her into, living vicariously through her brief escapades. She told me all about life in her square closet, which was also on my list of wonders to see during that brief visit. I was supposed to go into the office at some point that weekend, but I vowed to stay at least until she could show me her full art display in person, complete with real browsers stopping by to look at it. I also apparently needed to investigate some mysterious problem with the van she called the chocolate pudding effect, whatever that meant. At one point as we chatted, someone Nadia knew walked in and began to talk to her. A real awkward kid named Benny, holding a pencil and a sketch pad. He asked Nadia if he could ask me to sit for a sketch, but she apologized to him and said there really wasn't time today and she'd see him later. That led to her telling me more about the personalities of the folks she'd met at Vermilion Common, and she definitely perked up more when she talked about them, as opposed to how she was doing with her paintings. I doubt it's really possible that someone can show true signs of having changed or aged in just 3 months and change. So what I think I was sensing in her was a kind of exhaustion, that the gamble she'd made had taken a lot out of her. And every day that went by, she felt just as uncertain about where she was going as the day before. It was in the way she kept shifting the talk to her new friends instead of herself. And it was the way she stared out the window a lot, and her half-hearted interest in the truly superior cafe mochas we'd ordered. I couldn't help but ask her about money, and she of course refused any help, telling me when the time came to set that part of her life right, she would make the necessary sacrifice to do it. And maybe that would be the day the whole experiment ended, or maybe not. She did show me what she called her notebook of glory, which contained a notation of each piece of her art she had sold on the street. I laughed when I handed it back to her, and when she said, "What are you laughing at?" I replied, "Congratulations, sis. As your tax attorney, I can inform you that technically you've made enough off your art sales to make next year's filing complicated." I clapped my hands, and she clapped hers, hummingbird style, real fast. Really, what I was after in that conversation was what the odds were of her coming home. I wasn't deluded enough to believe she was going to come back with me then, or even in another month or two, but I was searching my mind for a way to delicately remind her, without trying to sway her at all, that her room would always be waiting. I made the mistake of asking her if the next time I drove up, I should bring her bunny ear pajamas, and said I was getting ready to delete her terrible free movie channels off the TV to make room for pro tennis. She despised pro tennis. That was when she caught on to my ruse. I'd simply mentioned home once too often. Tears came into her eyes. She shook her head once, forcefully, as if that would stop them. I asked her what was wrong. It was the timing of my visit and how I looked. She'd been trying not to ask me about my health, but she said it was obvious something was wrong. That must have been why I'd driven up, and that was what she'd been so worried about. Her face was becoming more red with every word. To give her hands something to do in that shaky moment, she reached for her paper cup and jostled some mocha out of the lid and down the side. She started to reach for a napkin, but then just stopped and squeezed her cup a little tighter. She insisted to me that she hadn't let my sickness affect the decisions she'd made, and she'd tried to convince herself she wouldn't let it affect what she tried next, but confronted with the truth of me sitting there practically swimming in my baggy shirt. Of course she'd come back, she said. Of course she would, right now. She could be packed up in 2 hours, and she wouldn't have any regrets about it, none at all. She'd gotten everything out of the common she'd wanted. I'd been an idiot. I hadn't realized the effect that losing more weight would have. She hadn't seen me in person since the 5th of March. I steadied myself, took a deep breath, leaned back in my chair, and said to her, "Hey, sis, guess what? The timing was intentional, but send the tears back to the factory, because it's good news your much wiser sibling has for your arty hippie self." I told her that the reason for the weight loss was a new regimen prescribed by the doctor to augment the gradual and dogged improvement of my condition, an improvement that had, over the spring, put me firmly in the outlier range of results that had been hoped for but not expected. I promptly tried to bore her with descriptions of my leukocytes and something called RBC monodispersion rates, medical jabber that meant something potentially very, very good for me. To put it more succinctly to her, I last woke up feeling like absolute garbage 4 weeks before, and since then, as long as I stayed away from the ring-dings, I was practically LeBron James. I'd waited 2 weeks to drop this bomb on her in person, and when it landed, it was every bit as satisfying as the great Monopoly comeback of 2012, when, walking a perfect tightrope between victory and bankruptcy, my final roll of the dice produced the statistically implausible 11 that devastated Nadia's Thanksgiving night hopes and dreams so completely that she wouldn't come out of her room for an hour in protest. There in the coffee house, she kept crying, but she also started to laugh in the middle of it, and then hit her face against the wall in embarrassment at the strange spectacle of her conflicting emotions. She threw her napkin at me in mock anger and pressed me for ever more details, but I tried to play it cool and casual, even when she came around the table and hugged me hard enough to break my sunglasses, for which I told her I would present a bill if she would be so kind as to provide me with the name of her agents at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I was driving us over to her neighborhood when she turned to me from the passenger seat and said excitedly, "I know how we're going to celebrate. Don't go to 16th Street yet. Go onto the Parkway." I protested, but she insisted she had some big reveal for me, and practically grabbed the wheel as we approached an exit ramp. 3 minutes later, she told me to take the turn for short-term garage parking at Hopkins International Airport. I laughed and demanded she reveal her nefarious intentions. "You're getting on a plane," she said. "I'm making you do the thing where you pick a random flight and get on it." I rolled my eyes in the way that our father used to tell me and Nadia we both did, in exactly the same way, complete with a little neck action for emphasis. I told Sis that as a boring adult who had come to contentedly despise everything, I was not about to succumb to such foolishness. She informed me that if I wanted to give her money, she had the right to refuse it and officially demand this instead, because, she reasoned, if I wasn't forced at gunpoint into some adventure finally, especially now in this good moment, I was just never going to have one. I reminded her I was there to see her display and hang out a bit before returning to the office to have my soul sucked clean by numbers and data. But she was fiercely determined. This relatively new side of her was such a marvel to behold that to stand in its way felt like cutting down a flower as it leaned directly toward the sun. My strategy was to partially humor her, while every yard that brought us closer to the garage brought with it another volley of logic from me about how impractical an actual plane trip really was at the moment. And to my great relief, it worked. Okay, a train then, she said. A train. Much simpler. No security, no waiting. After more delicate negotiations, I tentatively agreed to this. A train I could deal with, maybe. So that's how we wound up at the RTA transit station together, staring at the options on a big digital board mounted over a ticket counter. "How are you going to get back to your pad if I go off somewhere for the weekend?" I asked her. And she told me that of course it was understood I was loaning her my car, and that I had considerately filled up the gas tank for her. I have to admit, I was slowly starting to like this notion of hers. I hadn't taken a train trip since I was a kid. I remembered the magic of the snack car, where potato chips and soda had been bought for us both. I remembered the green blur of trees speeding by. As reality often does, though, it presented more roadblocks than solutions when it came to me being able to board a train to any place remotely fun within the next hour, since the actual Amtrak hub was across town. It truly felt this had to be about momentum and hurtling from one bad decision to the next without any time to think. "Okay," I said to Nadia, trying to process the ever-changing data on the overhead screens. "Here's what I can do. I can jump on this one commuter train to Toledo and do some kind of, activity there." She followed my eyes to the specific part of the screens I'd spotted, considering it. "How long a trip is that?" she asked. I went over to a glowing kiosk nearby, and with my finger I traced a path along a blue line dotted with unfamiliar places. "It's the end of the line, like 2 hours. Look," I said. I'd never been to Toledo, neither of us had. "And you'll stay at someplace really cool tonight," she commanded. "Some Airbnb that I pick out. I'll reserve it for you on my phone." "Deal," I said. We even shook on it. All our lives we had adhered, in all things, to a strict no-take-backsies policy, whose violation would bring the most dire punishment. There followed a pretty classic chase scene through the station as Nadia rushed me from the ticket kiosk to the turnstiles that allowed access to the arrival and departure platforms. "You've got to make that train," she said, laughing over her shoulder as I tried to keep up. And you know what? I really did have to make that train. The totally fake suspense became the key to the whole caper. As I moved, I desperately felt in my pockets to make sure I had my phone and my wallet, not to mention my 2 bottles of meds, which I'd taken from my glove box, just in case this whole thing truly happened. I did just make it on the train, Nadia reminding me at the last possible second to cough up my car keys. I had absolutely nothing on me but the essentials as the train pulled away. Before the doors closed, I scolded my sister that thanks to her, I was going to have to buy a toothbrush, toothpaste, a clean change of underwear, and yes, a wall charger. "Take that, sucker," she said gaily, and with a big sweep of her arm and a clumsy pirouette, she sent my train on its way to the west. Or maybe the north. Where Toledo actually was, I was only 80% certain. I watched her get smaller and smaller on the platform among the strangers standing around her. I put both hands to my head in mock exasperation and terror, pressing my face against the glass. And then she was gone. I really was excited to go to stupid Toledo and set foot in the overpriced mystery Airbnb Nadia would text me directions to, and eat alone in a restaurant she would undoubtedly ask me lots of questions about, and visit one truly interesting attraction the city had, which at that point was still unknown. It was true, I never would have done it on my own. I can honestly say I somehow felt I was going on the trip of a lifetime. All around me, tired people were just going home, sometimes so tired they rested their heads against the windows of the train. And would you believe it?
There he was, Tom Hamblin, waiting on the platform on the lower level. I spotted him as I came down the escalator on the other side. He was sitting alone, on a hard bench, slumped a little, while early rush hour people stood around waiting for the next train to roll through. He was in his business clothes, as usual, and looked a little rumpled. I got off the escalator and watched him from afar, just a little bit. He stared off into space, probably finishing his daily routine, worn out from it. I wondered how many trips he made along that line every week. A lot of stops and starts, whiny sounds of brakes inside the tunnels, garbled PA announcements, a lot of crowds, and people excusing themselves and standing in front of a kiosk adding money to his pass again and again, not especially enthusiastic about where he was going. Before he could spot me by chance, I turned and headed off to the parking lot.
From Nadia's journal, June 14th. Water Jill, but with people. No good result. Tried a small painting of Kent that way. Without him sitting for it, just memory. Not even good for a present or something. I really don't like what the water gel method does to faces or bodies. Makes people seem inconsequential. Like they're just passing through the physical world and will be gone as soon as you look away. Okay for landscapes and structures, but just makes me sad with faces. Can't do faces anyway. Would need to go back to classes for it. No feel for it still. Long haul. About as fun as doing an SAT test. Clinical. Weird how Kent looks kind of movie star-ish in the painting. Picked wrong tones. Not enough ruddiness. Light from too high an angle makes cheekbones seem even thinner. We'll probably stow it away somewhere. Try to finish it sometime, not now. Looking at it, too easy to think of the old bit of wisdom, still don't know where it came from. Forget the exact wording from when Uncle David told it to me. You should follow a dream until it dies. Then maybe go just a little bit further. I always remembered that. But then I think about Kent. Hard to square it all with getting older, becoming poor. Realities of what comes. Think hard on every decision.
Leo did survive his wild 18-hour vacation to Toledo, I'm happy to say, and came back with the photos to prove it. He finally got the full tour of Vermilion Common, pretty much, and when he got into his car to drive home, I managed to hold myself together pretty well, though I found myself standing on the street corner long after he was gone, strangely unwilling to move from that spot. It was a whole day before I felt fully immersed again in my new world. That Thursday morning, I came out onto the street and walked past Nate's van, and was startled to see him giving the interior a good going over with a hand vac. That part wasn't so strange as the fact that the van was totally empty inside. All his foster son's paintings were gone. The previous Monday, he told me, he'd gotten an email from a woman he'd sold a print to on Etsy a few months before. This woman worked for Best Western, and she was what they called a facilities buyer. She'd considered a lot of other painting styles for a project to populate the walls of the rooms of several new motels the company would be opening up in the region, but her staff seemed to like his foster son's cityscapes the most. And so, she had offered to buy them all from Nate, every single one of them in a group lot. He'd agreed on one condition, which was that the originals could not ever be disposed of without giving him the option of buying them back. The deal hadn't been for any serious kind of money, not at all. But after thinking it over long and hard, Nate had accepted the offer. He'd taken almost 49 of Terry's originals across town to have them professionally shipped, keeping just 2 for himself. He'd keep print-ready photos of everything else. The upshot of it all was that his days at Vermilion Common were ending. I was kind of floored. But Nate had made his choice. He told me he'd spent a sleepless night thinking about how Terry might feel, and he'd decided he would have been glad that so many people would look at his work now, and see it every day. It wouldn't have mattered to him as much what the context was, but maybe, more importantly, Nate simply needed to let the paintings go. Let the entire effort go. It was time. "It's too much. It's just too much for me," he told me softly, still trying to smile, and I hugged him tightly. I understood then. This way really was best. He'd spent as much time keeping Terry's flame truly burning as he possibly could. As for what came next, Nate thought he might very well go back to work. The days and nights would always be hard, but he still had energy to give. He liked training young people very much, and he thought there would be an office for him if he still wanted it. That did eventually happen for him, but it would be all the way in Columbus. I went with him the next day when he signed off on the shipment to the Best Western people and faxed over the papers to officially transfer ownership to them. "I liked looking at the paintings," the clerk told Nate as she processed his credit card. "I don't know how people can draw so well. I never could." Nate thanked her in his usual sunny way, never letting on how much that comment must have affected him. When we left, Nate tucked the receipt into his shirt pocket and remarked to me that she'd been very nice, hadn't she? Just a few days after that, a bunch of us saw him off as he drove away in his van to stay with his niece and nephew for a long vacation in Cape May, New Jersey. I remember Benny showing up with a bad head cold and giving Nate a warm can of Mountain Dew for the trip, and it seemed to me he had offered that exact same can a month before. That was Nate Weaver, my first friend in Vermilion Common, a man who liked everybody whether he liked them or not. He was kind to people and animals. He dug smoking a pipe, and he even square danced when he got the chance, though regrettably that was something I never did get to see him do. Kent came back to Varney Street on June 17th. There he was, on his blanket, on the corner, though instead of the usual navy blue relic with green trim he'd gotten so used to sitting on day after day, this blanket was pure black but dotted with white constellation patterns. He looked up at me when I came around the corner and, as usual, offered no word of greeting or even a nod, always expecting the other person would always be the first to speak in any interaction, always putting it on them to make the first move. I offered him a casual "welcome back" and sat down with him beside the blanket, leaning my back against the warm stone of the defunct Harbor Light Insurance Building, seeing the street as Kent saw it day after day. The moment was set up for some sort of an apology from one of us to the other. But that didn't happen. I sipped terrible instant coffee from my small thermal mug and tried to enjoy the light breeze and the morning silence on the street. Cars rumbled by on their way all over town, and a few 9 o'clock commuters walked past us toward the financial district, paying us no mind. These were the people Kent probably could have gotten pitying dimes from and quarters from if he had simply put an upturned hat atop his blanket, but that had never been what he was after. That morning had a new selection of about 30 books for sale, arranged carefully so as to feature some above the others. Occasionally, he would jot an interesting fact about a book or the author on an index card and tuck it inside the cover so the words would protrude just so. I had finally begun to realize that his inventory almost never had anything you'd gotten used to seeing ad nauseum in used bookstores. He curated his offerings carefully. We got into some chatter about the last couple of weeks in the Common. He admitted he didn't like to see Nate go. He'd always acknowledged that Nate was a genuinely good person, someone who was exactly what he presented. It was tough for me to think that anyone else in the Common had ever been so accommodating to him. I doubted there'd be any more invitations to potlucks in Kent's future unless I made them myself. "So, what have you been up to?" I finally asked him. It came out forced and after a long silence. "Not much," he said. He'd been planning for a while to take the bus out to Rochester and spend a day visiting, so that's what he'd done. With a short-term travel pass, he'd had a pretty good time making his way slowly back to Varney Street, stopping in Buffalo and Erie. He gave me the rundown of the highlights of the Buffalo Museum of History. I asked him who was in Rochester, and he said simply, "My kid." She was 5 years old, I learned that day, Kent's daughter. Her mother had married the manager of a True Value hardware store 4 years before. It was the first time Kent had ever seen the little girl. He was extremely uncomfortable with the look on my face and the soft, oh wow, I couldn't stop from escaping from my lips. He'd really only gone, he clarified, because the girl's mother had paid for everything and kicked him some extra money to boot. She and Kent had never officially wed, though they'd lived together for a year in a trailer home her parents owned. "Do you have a picture?" I asked, but Kent said he didn't. And beyond that, I felt it was intrusive to speak more about it. He'd been in Rochester just one full day. I thought of Kent bending over the little girl and saying hello for the first time, and then maybe the three of them had gone to the zoo and for ice cream. Maybe Kent had walked beside his daughter and been urged to take her hand so her mom could find something in her purse or go off to the restroom. Kent and his daughter at the zoo. And when it got to be late afternoon, maybe he'd given a few $20 bills on his way on foot back to the bus station, and empty promises had been exchanged about when he might come back. Or maybe that was simply never expected to happen. I would have given almost anything to know if he'd hugged the girl before they parted, and if he remembered her birthday each year. We watched the cars go by, and the pedestrians, almost all of whom were careful not to make eye contact. No one stopped to look at books. "Did Suzanne tell you I was in Ivy Behavioral?" Ken asked me suddenly, staring at the Dunkin' Donuts across the street. My face reddened. My delayed answer was a confused hybrid of excuse and half-truth. Crooking his body awkwardly, Kent dug into his jeans pocket, and from it, he took a bottle of pills and passed it over to me. I read the name of the medicine aloud, pronouncing it carefully. He said to me, "I have to go there to get this filled and sign in with somebody. This is the only stuff I've ever been on. I've never seen the inside of the place except the pharmacy. You know what conversion disorder is?" Humbled, I silently shook my head no. "It means a neurological thing that they can't figure out. Could be a lot of things for different people. Sometimes it's that I lose the feeling of touch in my hands or feet, or I can't swallow right. Goes on for hours. A whole couple of days once. That's all it is, since I was 12. But because it's put down as a stress thing in some people, I have to go to Ivy for that stuff. I could probably throw it away any time and get by just fine." He looked at me defiantly. "That's why I go there. That's why." He took the pills back from me and worked them back into his pocket. I said nothing. I felt like if I could just hold the silence convincingly and wait, he might talk more. So I waited. But all he really said to bring our conversation to an end was this. "You know, I think about the future just as much as anyone else does." And though he seemed so close to adding more, in the end he didn't. I nodded. Didn't feel it would help to respond, so I never knew exactly what he was telling me, what sort of defense it was meant to be of who he was and how he lived. There was an exchange of subdued see-you-laters, and then I was headed back toward the apartment, thinking that though Kent was back now, it was more uncertain than ever that we would stay in each other's spheres. That night, not feeling up for painting for the third night in a row, I tried to compose a short letter to him about what I thought I needed from him to keep being friends, the essential clay and reed that had to be set in place to build something that might last. Just 2 or 3 paragraphs written out by hand. But it was all an incoherent disaster, and into the trash it went. I had done a lot of that since I was 16 or so, writing letters that I never meant to send. It was my way of working through an understanding of people without confronting them. Whether that was a healthy thing or not, I wasn't sure. I laid down in my sleeping bag, regretting not asking his daughter's name, or if he'd had any part in deciding it. If he had, I'm sure it was a lovely one. Something memorable, something proud. Maybe a reference to some literary heroine even English professors might not easily recall. Unusual, certainly. A Kent kind of name. Not easily forgotten.
After the senators had left her, she stood and looked out the west portal down at the open dock, where intense heat shimmer obscured the first rank of a sweeper fleet. She usually liked to watch the smaller crafts take off on routine mining missions to Panyon. They gave her a sense of order and security when things were very still. But now the beginnings of a headache pulsed in her temple, and she looked instead at the stars. "Iomine," a new voice said behind her, and she turned in wonder, not having heard her birth name used in a decade or more. Impossibly, it was Sher Domin, looking no older than the day he had left for Captus. 6 years he'd been gone, yet all that was different about him was his formal military wear and an L-shaped scar beside his right eye. There was no moment of reunion, no exchange of reminiscence. "Who else survived?" she asked him without hesitation, already knowing the answer. The use of her old name seemed to make it certain. This was the gravitas Sher Domin had learned to adopt in the last stages of his ambitious rise in rank. He started to answer with delicate effort, but she turned away. It wasn't that she had expected to hear anything different. It was that the ghosts of the dead had not risen to find her until this very moment. From that night on, until she was lawfully permitted to give the order to attack Captus with all the readied cruiser fleets and avenge those ghosts, she would in quiet moments hear her birth name coming from their airless mouths in whispers without color.
From Iomene's War, the Ocean of Bellows series, Part 3, by Kent Dooley, self-published.
There was a morning when I came out of the apartment carrying 2 new paintings I'd stubbornly pushed through, and I lingered on the sidewalk because the air felt a little bit different somehow. A different kind of front had come through after a long stretch of wet summer weather, and the air had that clean, cool snap that to me always felt like it was the first sensory sign that yes, autumn would be a real thing again. It was coming, not now, heck no, but someday not too far away. That always brought a flood of nostalgia for me. I thought about the times my parents took me to shop for school supplies and how excited I got at the thought that I was going to get brand new pens in a brand new zipper bag and my pick of notebooks, even the fancy kind. And maybe that would be the magical year I'd become a popular kid. It had been 160 days since I'd come to Vermilion Common. A season and a half away from home. Feeling a bit stuck artistically, I'd gotten out around the city more in July, more than I ever even planned, learning the quirks of the public transportation system because my almost non-existent income got me a discount pass. I started really learning the neighborhoods and checked off a lot of the must-dos of Cleveland. I started to know what people in Vermilion Common meant when they talked about the Lake Effect or West Side Market or Perkins Beach. More and more I went out alone instead of with other people. I got plenty of the folks on the block on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, after all. Sometimes Suzanne would go with me on trips for art supplies, but she wasn't much on galleries anymore, and she got tired easily on those jaunts. I'd ride the buses with my sketch pad, but more often now it was with my journal, writing down how I was feeling about painting and life in general.
Because the days started to feel so long, Nadia tried volunteering at the local food bank a few hours on Mondays and Tuesdays, receiving boxes into their inventory beside Colin Chickwood and his girlfriend, who had talked her into it. It was a bit physically much for her, but on the way coming in and out of the building, she liked to glance through the glass windows in the hallway to see the main warehouse space. There, Nadia could see people of all kinds browsing the long steel racks, deep in consideration, carrying cut-down cardboard boxes containing what they wanted to take away to cook and eat. That one moment would sustain her through the backaches, even when she saw kids with their parents helping to carry things to the checkout desk. She told me that once that August, she even went into the Four Saints Gallery late on a Sunday afternoon. A fairly big show devoted to neo-expressionism had opened up, and she did a single walk-through. Not sure about whether she wanted to accidentally bump into Tom Hamblin or not. That bit of hope she'd felt when he'd bought her print and talked about the autumn show seemed like a relic now, a very minor moment consigned to the past. She admired the work on the walls around her and how eclectic the collection was, and she sat in front of one particular piece called Bus Stop for Lonely Sea Captains by a new Vietnamese artist for a long, long time. And then she left. She still chatted with Kent once in a while, but their exchanges didn't last very long. It seemed forever ago that he'd approached her with an offer to install a payment app on her phone, and she thought sometimes about how uncharacteristic that gesture turned out to be for him. It was as if he'd seen something in her back then that hadn't panned out for him, and she'd let him down somehow. So he'd found ways to become more and more isolated from her without even consciously realizing he was doing it. There were no more test letters written to him and then thrown into the trash. She kept selling her work out of the van at the usual rate, without any real sense of progression, though. She was worried that if she looked at the numbers too hard, she'd see that things were actually slowing down for her as summer went on. People seemed to like her paintings of public beaches after dark the most, with the water gel paintings getting a few nice comments but rarely an actual sale. It all made her enough to cover her supplies and groceries each month, but nothing else. And so on August 6th, she found herself at a job interview for the first time in a year and a half, applying at some place called Bell Sound Publishing. The routine was very familiar to her, and all the answers she gave were completely by rote. It was a receptionist job this time, something she hadn't actually done before, and it was going to cancel her sidewalk Fridays at Vermilion Common. The woman who interviewed her, she said, was very nice, and asked her what she liked to do in her spare time. For some reason, Nadia only told her that she liked exploring the city, reading, and going to museums sometimes. But she didn't get the job anyway. They never called her back.
The talk on the street and in Johnny's submarine turned entirely to the Midtown Rally Project, the city's redevelopment plan for the area, which, after 3 separate attempts to find an actual partner with the money to turn the land around Vermilion Common into a stretch of condos and retail, seemed to be rolling forward unexpectedly and fast. Some company called New Archipelago had been awarded the contract to pitch their vision, and that vision was published online for all to see. Some of the artists had a fun, mean time criticizing the artwork in the wonderland of unnamed shops and parks and marble-sided office buildings. But everyone was also really worried because we were totally part of the geographic area that was going to be flipped into profitability. The block that currently held about 1/3 of the people in Vermilion Common was detailed in this whole scheme as one of the first stretches to be reworked into a row of luxury apartments with the tenantless chemical bank building torn down entirely. That means someone already knows we're all gonna get the bums rush off the block, Frank Lemessier told me with no trace of his usual good humor. The pro bono lawyer who was working a little bit each week for the Commons preservation apparently echoed this sentiment, off the record. As a few of us stood on the street, looking over someone's shoulder at their laptop as they scrolled through those plan sketches, someone made the comment that this lousy art had probably drawn more eyeballs in 1 hour than his own stuff had in the last 2 years. The third Saturday in August, weird thunderstorms came through the area, and it rained and blew so hard that Suzanne and I couldn't go down to the sidewalk at 10 to open up for the day. Mark Doges waved at me from inside his van down there, pretty much trapped by the downpour, having frantically swept his metal easels off the sidewalk just in time for the latest cloudburst to wreak havoc. Suzanne stayed at the kitchen table and slowly finished work on a lovely and kind of mysterious painting of stray dogs in an abstract castle. Over the past several years, she developed subtle and sometimes not so subtle tremors in her hands during certain muscle movements, tremors she'd learned to work around and even adapt into her imagery. No one looking at it knew that the soft upflicks in the hair of her humans and animals were a result of conscious thwarting of those tremors. They had begun to demand more and more thematic workarounds. Her doctor had a theory they might be related to damage done by her addictions years before. Suzanne laughed about it all ruefully as we sipped hot tea and watched the rain, and occasionally jumped at a tremendous thunderclap. The skies cleared up magically and completely a half hour later, but she told me she was bagging that day on the sidewalk entirely anyway, which really surprised me. She liked the idea of lying down for a while and maybe watching old movies and eating some of the fried stuff Kara routinely brought back from Buffalo Wild Wings. "Help an old lady to her drawing room, little chief," she said, putting the back of her hand dramatically to her forehead. Little chief was what she always called me. I was under the impression Suzanne hadn't ever missed a sidewalk day in the year and a half she'd been there. She'd had a bit of a stressor the day before, though, when a critic who used to write for The New Yorker and Time Out came through and talked her ear off about her work and the people they'd both known in the Manhattan art scene. Whatever persona Suzanne had inadvertently cultivated there, which had been celebrated for a good 10 years by others in that world, it was not someone she wanted to remember or keep alive. An hour before the browsing day on the Common unofficially ended, I got a text from a number I hadn't seen since late May. It was Tom. He was just saying hello, and he apologized for not getting in touch earlier. He wanted to know if I was interested in attending the evening opening of a sort of funky warehouse installation/photography show at a pop-up gallery near Cleveland Public Square, and talk about art and how the show I had submitted to was coming along. I let the text sit for a bit. We met in front of the Great Lakes Theater on Prospect Avenue at dusk the next day, and started to walk west down Euclid toward the show. Tom was there right on time, and he shook my hand again. The Friday night crowds were starting to really come out and hit all the bars and restaurants. This was the kind of hectic scene I usually went out of my way to avoid, but Tom seemed to like all that human energy. It just intimidated me and made me feel underdressed. We talked about the Midtown Rally project as we walked because he had a little insight on the situation, having made a friend on the city's Board of Commissioners when he'd fight to get landmark status for the space beside the Four Saints Gallery. Tom didn't think it looked very good for Vermilion Common. Knew Archipelago was not a developer that promised but then didn't deliver, and they had a great deal of money. The pop-up was inside a gloomy but airy space above a Latin restaurant, booming its music so loud I imagined I could actually feel it in the edges of my elbows. Up a dark stairwell and down a long hallway, we went into the show. All the lights had been turned out and the windows temporarily blacked. We and the other patrons of the show slowly followed an improvised maze of sections of rusty chain-link fence past a series of neon lamps of different vivid colors, representing the only light sources in the place. Around each lamp, stunningly lifelike papier-mâché sculptures of realistic-looking city dwellers crowded around, reaching out to touch the glowing lamps in awe. The light brushed their faces softly. All those artificial people, men, Women, young, old, seemed to be consciously trying to ignore large photographs of the most poverty-stricken parts of Cleveland hanging from the ceiling along the path. Those photos were deeply sad, taken in a very different world than the one inside the gallery space and outside on the buzzing street. Beyond the big space, normal light came through an open door that eventually drew us out into a very casual reception. I happened to see what turned out to be the show's sole sculptor and photographer sitting hunched over on a stool in a little alcove off to the side, all alone, scrolling through her cell phone. It was kind of a jarring image considering what we had just walked through. Tom took a fancy little flute of champagne off a linen-covered table where they were lined up flawlessly in tight rows of 8, and he offered one to me, and we stood there talking for a bit among the gathering of art lovers. Tom had a very good memory for the names of the people he'd met months before at the potluck, and he seemed to like hearing the details about some of my interactions with them from before and after, especially the little day trips to places out in nature. As someone who didn't get out there as much as he wanted to, he seemed kind of amazed at the length of a hike I'd done with Suzanne one day, which had been kind of an accident caused by bad directions and her own refusal to give up when we were clearly beaten. He asked me a lot of questions about the first drawings I'd ever done that I felt proud of, and my attempts to find a group of friends I felt comfortable with in high school. He'd been a bit of an outsider there too, except in his case it was because he was a lightning streak of straight A's and very thinky extracurricular activities. He remembered his parents signing him up for a Mensa meeting when he was 17 and being mortally embarrassed at being there, a good 10 years younger than anyone else. We left the pop-up and kept talking as we moved along the busy street, night having fallen. I kept hoping he was going to mention the gallery show, even as I did enjoy the conversation. He was funny, but seemed hyper-aware that he shouldn't be too funny, and was actually apologetic when he made one too many witty asides. He didn't have too many chances at work to lighten up, he said. Not as many as he thought he would in the beginning. He'd gone to work at the gallery exactly 1 week after leaving law school, at the end of his second year. Off to the beach in Cape Cod with 2 friends for 4 days, and then his father had his office all prepared for him. It was obvious from the way he talked about the law that he was fascinated by it. He occasionally put a little of his knowledge into practice at the gallery, but not very much. He struggled to find the words for how he felt each day, surrounded by such a nice atmosphere and involved in some very intense work. "I'm just in a universe down the block from where I probably should be," he told me finally, and we veered off Euclid into a thankfully quieter stretch where I didn't have to step off the street sometimes just to avoid oncoming throngs. Tom offered to walk me all the way back to my apartment.
He didn't have such hot news about the gallery show, he said. The originally conceived size of it was being cut down by almost half because one of the artists with an exhibition going on currently had put up the money to extend it another full season. Basically, Tom told her, this guy had written a check for the entire redo of the gallery's auditorium. That's what it came down to. Ironically, this nakedly privileged gesture came about because the artist was so passionate about excellence that he wanted to add to the exhibition and was toiling 7 days a week alone in his studio to get things right that he thought had gone wrong. Nadia knew the artist's name, but she wasn't such a big fan.
All that being said, my paintings were still fully in consideration, though at this point Tom had no sway over the decisions about what would be going in and what wouldn't. He said I should feel very good that so many people had already studied the paintings and were impressed enough with them to keep the conversation going. I've lost the ability to predict what they'll decide about anything at all, he said a little sadly. It felt like the statement had a lot going on in it. I asked him if he ever thought about going back into the law, and he told me he thought about it all the time. He was coming to see how easy it was for a group of highly educated, nice, sincere, well-meaning people, including his father, to come together and make everything twice as complicated as it was the day before. He forced a laugh, and I did my best to join him in it. We were quiet for a while as we made a turn toward Thornton, having now left the Friday night chaos far behind. He asked me if I'd ever heard of a painting by Ramda Isniri called Sun Be Tamed. I said I hadn't. He just nodded, looking down at his shiny shoes as we moved. "It's my favorite one ever. I'm not sure why," he said, and let it go at that. We talked about the things that had struck us most about the show that night. What lingered more than anything for me, strangely, and which I didn't mention, was the very first image that had greeted me upon entering the reception. A very small Hispanic man in a tuxedo shirt, leaning over the serving table and filling each of those tiny champagne flutes from a bottle with extraordinary care, looking so grave and focused as his hands steadied it, making things lovely for the appreciators of art. Tom didn't make any kind of overture to come up to my door or anything. Fingers crossed, he said, there'd be good news in 10 days or so about my paintings. After I'd thanked him for a fun night that I really did feel I needed, he had one more question to ask me. He wanted to buy another print of mine and wanted to make sure I'd have it handy in the upcoming weekends at Vermilion Common. He didn't know the name of the painting, so he tried to describe it. And there was a strange and kind of uncomfortable moment when his memories of the image didn't seem to align with anything I'd done.
For a second there, it seemed like he'd made a real gaffe, confused her with someone else. Then the mention of a certain sliver of country road finally clicked for Nadia, and she slapped her head. He had taken something a bit different from the painting than she'd intended when she created it, and his memories of it had then slowly aligned it even more to his initial impressions, rearranging details of the image and even the scale. It really was hers, this image of two elderly women struggling with the umbrella they shared, which Nadia remembered vividly from 5 years before and then painted on a snowy afternoon. But Tom clearly had his own version of it that had left her parenting and gone on its own toward only one person. Where would that version go, she wondered later, when he saw the real thing again? She told him she'd have the print for him whenever he came back.
We said goodnight, and he went one way and I went the other. And I looked back over my shoulder at one point because I didn't want him to do the same and see only someone moving away from him and closing a door. This time, unlike after the potluck, he didn't give me a mildly dorky wave. He just nodded gently, standing still on the sidewalk. And somehow the nature of his feeling for me was apparent then. Just in the way he watched me part the doorway and leave him, his feet rooted to the sidewalk, not going anywhere until I was warm and safe. I did look up his favorite painting online that night on my laptop. It was so simple, an abstract piece showing the small red silhouettes of 3 horses on a featureless desert plain. They roamed under a sky divided neatly in strict geometric wedges, each of which was a variant of deep blue. You could know someone for decades and never quite understand what it was they were truly seeing in a painting like that. The layers under layers that could only belong to them. On the 1st of September, I put the van to a new use, which was driving Suzanne all the way out to Slippery Rock to visit her sister, who she alleged was much crazier than she was, a former flower child who only got more flowery and impractical as the years went on. Suzanne's station wagon was badly in need of all kinds of work and was staying behind on the street. After loading up some of her favorite things and starting the drive down to Route 80, Suzanne and I held firm in pretending that this was just a 4-week visit to a relative she hadn't seen in 2 years. She was coy in her answers about her return, so it felt to me like it was going to be much longer. My hope was that because she wasn't taking any of her painting gear along, she really would be coming back to the apartment in due course. But more and more recently, her bouts with fatigue and her tremors had been dulling her progress. She went through this sometimes, she claimed, relegating the problems to the category of routine dry spells. "One day soon, that'll just be it," she told me mildly, tapping her cigarette ash out the window as we drove across the countryside. "I'll just give away what's left of the oils and brushes, and then it'll just be me and Murder, She Wrote till the end." She hadn't added her usual sly cackle at the end of this sentence. Unloading her stuff at her sister's, I really noticed how many irreplaceable mementos she'd taken with her, even a couple of things from her wild, regrettable, painful but productive work and shining past in the art world. these weren't the things you only took somewhere for 4 weeks. We parted with an elaborate hug, and I drove back to Vermilion Common after turning down her offer of a little financial help. I was 0 for 16 in applying for jobs recently. I wondered if I was coming off differently at these interviews than I had back in Lancaster. Colder, as if there were something that was always in me now that was resisting normality and authority more strongly. I couldn't shed the feeling of antagonism I felt when I sat down in front of someone now to pretend I was interested in what they were offering, and the dwindling numbers I wrote down on the back page of my journal made it clear that this was a real problem. I went past Kent's hovel on my way through Pound Street. It had been a couple of weeks since I'd seen him last. Seeing him in Johnny Submarine recently, Suzanne had actually offered him a little money to move her things into the van for us before our trip to her sister's, but she'd said he seemed to really be fighting a bad flu and couldn't do it, so in the end it was the girls' brigade who'd done the heavy lifting. Back in the apartment, I poked my head into Suzanne's empty room. It was true. Her painting gear was sealed away very neatly in some hat boxes she and I had cheerfully scavenged from beside the dumpster behind the Container Store in Beechwood. They'd been flawlessly preserved, and I remembered we'd gone to 7-Eleven to buy each other candy bars in celebration of our find. Later that month, during one of our texting sessions, I asked Suzanne if she wanted me to run her supplies out to her. Surely, I said, she must be getting inspired by the dramatic change in scenery. Her sister lived on 3 quiet, wide-open acres she shared with her 3 ducks, a couple of chickens, 2 dogs, and a cat. In response to my question, she simply responded, "No, I don't think so," with a smiley face emoji attached. But it wasn't quite the plain vanilla smiley face. Instead, it was the one that had been designed to seem like a shrug. I read some meaning into that. It turned out I was probably right to. In the waning days of summer, she called me and told me about the arrangements she was making to stay with her sister long term. I was welcome to come out and hang out with the Social Security twins anytime I liked, she said, and stay as long as I wanted. There were a few things she eventually requested I bring from her boxes of art supplies, but the sketchbooks and leftover oils could be given to Damaso Candelaria, noted fan of the science fiction works of Kent Dooley. After that, I could have her room. Damaso himself had decided to leave for his old home in Detroit before that conversation even happened. When a big banner was strung across the front of the old chemical bank building with the logo of the developer Tom had mentioned, it had ripple effects like that through, all of Vermilion Common. Most people seemed to agree it would be months and months before anything like a bulldozer rolled into the area, but it would surely happen before next summer. The thought of enduring another cold Cleveland December, knowing things were so unpredictable, was what caused the artist Loretta Shand to break the lease on her stifling attic apartment above the awful arcade and head off to California with her psychedelic paintings of infamous political figures in tow. "I've been watching a lot of surfing videos online," she told me, grinning. "That's something I really think I can do, and I think LA is where I need to be anyway." I remember her now always being very shrewd about marketing and public exposure, more so than anyone else I met in the community. And she did go on to have a lot of success barely 6 months after she rolled into Santa Monica with no place to call home. She eventually went on to win a lot of awards for posters she did for theater productions and a few big studio movies. Most of the artists parked along Pound Street up to Thornton Avenue were staying, content to wait and see what happened with all the construction plans. After all, many of them, me included, wouldn't have ever come to the Common if they had easier options. So there was no noticeable drop-off in the energy level of the show when weekends rolled around. I even sold my 200th print on a morning when a cold snap had come through and temperatures at night dipped below 50 for the first time in a long time. When I made the slash mark in the back of my journal and realized I had reached a very modest milestone, I walked over to the fancy coffee shop a mile away and bought myself a large mocha, the cost of which represented about 1/3 of what I had made off the sale of that print. "C'est la vie d'artiste," I said aloud as I sat beside the window looking out at the street, tasteful jazz playing above my head. Surrounded by life and conversation. No one noticed. Over-sugared, I later climbed the stairs back up to the apartment and ran into Kara in the kitchen. She had her work uniform on and was getting ready to head off to her Ford and midnight shift, which tended to run over a lot. She was so sick of the free food at Buffalo Wild Wings that she made batches of ham and pickle sandwiches to take with her, wrapping them carefully in plastic wrap, and she was stacking that week's collection when I came in. She said someone was actually in Suzanne's room at that moment, a possible renter. She normally would have told me that ahead of time, but there wasn't much need for that anymore, what with me having now set a date for moving out myself. I walked into Suzanne's room to say hello to this person. It was a young woman of truly unusual height, definitely a little over 6 feet. She was on the bulky side and wore a big black men's trench coat that the weather didn't really call for. Her fiery red hair was tied back in the tightest bun possible, her face pale, makeup-free. Her name was Brett, and when she spoke, I almost involuntarily flinched with the force of her volume, which remained consistently epic no matter what the conversation called for. Brett's uncle, who was waiting for her downstairs, had brought her, explaining to Kara that he would be the one paying for her rent and groceries while her part-time job as a dishwasher, one she'd found with the help of the Department of Social Services, would give her a little spending money. The idea was to begin to get her finally out into the world at age 30, a year after her mother had passed away. Brett paced the room, very impressed with its size and color, and spoke with me very agreeably and fast, telling me about her job and how her uncle had just turned 65 and detailing the trip to Edgewater Park they'd made for it. I thought that her very size and the deep hoarseness of that booming voice probably gave strangers pause even before they realized that she tended not to stick with one line of thought for longer than a sentence or two. She asked me if she could have a soda or some water, and I went to the kitchen to get her something. There, Kara mentioned the figure Brett's uncle was willing to pay for the room, considerably more than she'd be able to get from anyone else. She poured a Pepsi into a glass and handed it back to me with a weak smile. Brett was actually lying on Suzanne's bed when I came back. "It's not as big as mine," she said. "It's funny that my feet stick out." She wiggled them around and accepted her soda, laying down. She was clearly very excited at the prospect of having her own room in a different place for the first time. I told her I wanted to give her something as a welcome present if she decided to stay. And I went into the closet I'd lived in for months, and I brought her a painting I'd done recently of the orchard where my mother had taken me and my brother to pick cherries when we were little kids. Brett, standing once more, looked at it avidly, yet she had no vocal reaction that was much different than when I'd handed her the soda. "Thank you kindly," she announced, and remained holding the painting throughout our parting, the frame clenched tight in both of her big hands. Before she left, I told her that I might not get to see her move in, but that no matter what, I would come back to say hello and see how she was doing. I definitely would. And this really seemed to please her. I stuck my hand out and Brett gave it a good long shake, very businesslike. "Have a nice day," she said, and I wished her the same.
And my sister decided on the spur of the moment to head out again for a long, long walk around the waterfront in the summer sunshine, watching birds and the boats in the harbor, and all the people come and go.
Tom.
The final selections for the October show at the gallery, to be called Grails of a Lake Town, were made on a Friday afternoon. 5 of us settled into the conference room with coffee from the new Keurig machine. I was in no real position to influence anyone either way at that point beyond adding a paragraph in a Google Doc. Almost all artistic decisions were made by other folks at the gallery, and rightfully so, I guess, because they were the ones with the formal education in it, not just days when I was younger wandering through museums, admiring skills I wish I was born with. I'd written a couple of research papers on Gustav Klimt back in the day too, but I was far more a logistics person. And I had my hands full all day with accountants, newspaper editors, agents, electricians, and caterers. There was a point that morning when every one of us had our laptops open before us, and our weekday admin was formatting artists' names and contact information on a spreadsheet. And on the wall beside me, our young head of acquisitions, Haley O'Day, projected the image of 3 paintings side by side, all embedded on a bland PowerPoint slide, naturally losing all their depth and texture and having their colors washed out a little. Nadia's painting, Green Walls on a Red Morning, was among them. Haley wanted Chuck Dillion's approval to give a woman named Elaine Nobbs a place in the show over the other two entries on the slide, and he nodded, admiring the work adjacent to Nadia's. He said he felt like Miss Nobbs' work was much more about what was going on in the world beyond the gallery, and that's what the people still seemed to be responding to in this time as much as anything else. He thought the collection might be running a little weak on the social commentary, and her painting would round out the local artist's work well. Art that was mostly about itself wasn't connecting quite as well in the East as opposed to the West. It was one of those inscrutable regional trends we saw a lot of. It was unexpected to me that Haley would ask me for my opinion in that moment, because I had already submitted mine in writing, which was how she preferred to do things. I told her simply that Green Walls on a Red Morning and Blizzard of '99, water gel works Nadia had called them, had made me think of the physical world a little differently, and that despite it being depicted so unusually, the effect was an optimistic one somehow, though I couldn't exactly say why. Chuck Dillion agreed that her work was oddly comforting in a way. It showed a gentle breakage of things assumed to be firm. To represent what Vermilion Common is about, I would err on the side of work that's more city-focused and issues-based, Haley told the group, and she seemed prepared to move on. So did everyone else. But before she could dig into the budgeting report she'd brought and shift the discussion to it for the duration, I straightened up in my chair a bit and asked the table gently how anyone had come to decide what Vermilion Common was about, if that was a thing that had somehow come to be known. Papers that had begun to be shuffled were set down again. Haley stressed what she meant was that the idea of Vermilion Common created in the popular imagination of the city would be changing in the wake of the redevelopment deal that might wipe it out entirely. By the time the show started, it would likely be seen as a place where artists struggled against privileged developers and a money-hungry city council that was uncomfortable with them being there. That's what Elaine Nobbs' work reflected well in her painting, the struggle between the oppressive haves and the faceless have-nots. I told her I suppose that might be true, and that the works up there on the screen besides Nadia's were equally fine. And then I couldn't seem to stop myself from continuing to speak, though papers had once again been lifted. When I myself thought of Vermilion Common, I said, I tended to think of a woman I'd met there named Erica. She'd come there from New York, where things hadn't worked out for her at all. And she'd been living for 5 months in a bakery truck she'd bought for $200 at a police auction. She painted apples. That's it. Her paintings showed red and green apples by the dozens and hundreds, collecting in places they normally didn't in real life. Red apples spread across the streets of Rome, or thousands of them bobbing in the Atlantic, or inhabiting a children's playground so completely there was no room to even play. I had asked her why she painted the apples, and all she said was, "Because I think they'll make people happy if they just keep looking." My colleagues around the room responded appreciatively to my anecdote to varying degrees, and after a long, uneasy moment of quiet, Haley thanked me again for all my hard work on the show. It couldn't be happening without me, she said, and sometimes it was easy to forget that to see this work in its natural habitat was a very different experience. As we all sipped coffee from the nice Keurig machine and sat in our comfortable chairs in the soothingly lit conference room, I looked quietly up at the 3 paintings on the PowerPoint slide, left there on the wall in digital limbo as the discussion moved past them, never to come back to them. And 5 days later, I shocked my father by telling him I was leaving the gallery business to go back to law school.
September 29th was the day I more or less set to make the drive back to my brother's house in Lancaster. It didn't take much time at all to arrange things, and for that I felt a bit sad. Because big changes should need planning, should require work. It's sad to break a tether too easily or unnoticed. 2 days before I left, I made a series of solo trips to the van to stow my paintings and supplies in there, plus the handful of other things I'd acquired at Vermilion Common. It was parked a half-mile away now to create more space for another artist, whoever that might turn out to be. The informal borders of the common had actually expanded a little since March, as new folks arrived or the residents stretched their wings a bit. I started giving my goodbyes to some of the people on the street, spacing them out over a couple of days. I had been thinking hard about how to approach Kent about it. Every day that passed without us seeing each other, the more distance grew between us and the more awkward the options seemed for saying so long. I just didn't want to do it. Taking the van across town to do all my laundry at once, I had glimpsed him on his book blanket as I went through an intersection nearby. He was writing, head down, fast, oblivious to the life of the street. Someone came up to the blanket and knelt to look at his offerings. I could have stopped then, but I decided to put it off. I spent 2 more nights at Kara's after I'd locked the van up and moved it. Brett, Kara's new roomie, would be moving in about 7 days. On the 29th, I put my backpack over my shoulder and said so long to Kara, who rose tiredly from the sofa where she would spend her day off watching TV and recovering from another shift of sweating it out in the kitchen at work. As she saw me out, I told her I hoped she'd have some luck finding a different job situation, somewhere they'd respect her time more. She shrugged and said in a resigned kind of way, "Everyone's got to work somewhere, right?" I nodded and said, "Yeah." It was pouring down rain, and at the last minute I bowed to the fear of starting to drive the van in the dark in that kind of downpour. I knew one of the artists had a floating under-the-table Airbnb offer for use of her tiny camper, so I took her up on it rather than return to the apartment, and sort of relived the experience of curbside living from March, but with fabulous cotton sheets and an air mattress to sleep on. It wasn't until the morning of the 30th, then, that I'd be able to walk the 8 blocks toward the van with my old sleeping bag bunched under my right arm, ready to leave Vermilion Common. I still had a couple of errands to do on foot, one of which was to find Kent. But that all went completely sideways when my cell phone rang at 6 a.m. as I lay sleeping in the camper with a painting of Jesus at the Last Supper beside my head. It was the police. The full story of what had happened could only be pieced together bit by bit, source by source, over the course of hours. I was told Kent was in Metro Health Hospital. He'd listed me as an emergency contact. The other had been his sister, but they hadn't been able to reach her yet. Kent had been hurt in an accident. It was just 6 blocks to the hospital, and I ran all the way there, leaving all my stuff in the camper. There was a delay in getting in to see Kent because of some kind of complicated treatment to his shoulder, which had been severely sprained, and he also hadn't passed a concussion test. Added to that, there was the matter of the police, who wanted to clear up why Kent was at the wheel of a vehicle he did not own when they came across it in a drainage ditch. An officer with a soothing voice, who was kind enough to talk to me as if he had all the time in the world, explained what he could to me. The vehicle he was talking about was my van. I didn't have to make up my mind about whether or not to press charges just yet, the officer assured me. I only retained about half of what he told me. Before I was able to talk to Kent, all sorts of confusing and disturbing scenarios played out in my head. Finally, at about 11, I was allowed to go in, where he shared a small room divided by a tall screen. He was tucked neatly in a skinny bed, a stout-looking bandage beside his left ear where he'd sustained a nasty gash. There was something about the stark whiteness of the sheets and the floor that made him look unusually frail and hopelessly out of place. I imagined this is what he might look like in 40 years, back in a hospital for some procedure he might be facing alone. Trying to keep things light, he immediately made a joke about how he refused to leave until he got the free room service lunch he'd been promised by a nurse. "Look, I can have anything I want off this thing. It's great," he said, and held up the menu. He would have put off telling me what happened forever if he could have. I had to gently coax out almost every sentence. He was still in some pain, mostly in his shoulder, and movement was very unpleasant. They limited him to 2 extra-strength Tylenol. Kent said he was sorry the van was wrecked. He thought it would probably cost more to fix than it was worth. The front bumper was hanging off, and there was probably structural damage up front. I told him I couldn't care less about that. At about 4 that morning, he'd been walking along Ebbett Avenue from 7-Eleven. A dumb time to go out, he knew, but he hadn't eaten anything all day, and he'd gotten a 7-Eleven gift card for taking a series of surveys about the health insurance he got through the state. He'd seen my van idling at a blinking red light on an adjacent block, and he thought that was very weird, that I'd be out at that hour. It was the only vehicle around, and it didn't seem to be going anywhere. He'd gotten a strange feeling, so he crossed the street and walked up to the driver's side window. A man in a denim jacket was sitting in the front seat talking on a cell phone. Kent had said something to him, and the guy had immediately cut off his call and started to move the gear shift out of park. And Kent knew right away that this guy had stolen the van. I'd left it in not so smart a spot. He didn't stop for rational thinking, he told me. Didn't think at all. He had about half a second to react. He'd pulled on the driver's side door and it opened. The man had shoved an arm out to keep him out while the van began to roll forward. As Kent grabbed at the wheel, he had one foot inside the van and the other hopping along to keep up with the slow roll. "Must have looked pretty funny from far away," he said, closing his eyes and tilting his head back on his pillow. There was a chunk of a few seconds missing in his memory then, but he did remember getting hit in the face, his head rocking back, and fuzzy stars dancing in his brain, and the van suddenly accelerating. Then the man was clambering out the passenger's side door with the van still moving. Kent had tried to steady the wheel, but the visuals through the windshield had confused him. He thought maybe he was stunned by the punch he'd taken. He sensed a car coming and tried to get out of the way and yanked the wheel to the left while accelerating. The van had bumped over the train tracks and then down a 4-foot slope into a ditch. That was where Kent had been sitting for almost 10 minutes in a light daze when a jogger had stopped and told him to sit very still while he called for an ambulance. I couldn't stop myself from marveling aloud that he'd gone to such lengths to stop that broken-down heap from being stolen. He looked down at his bare feet, which poked out from the bottom of the sheet at the end of the bed. "I figured your paintings might be in there," he said. "It sucks that someone would try to take those, too." His eyes were heavy-lidded. The Tylenol was kicking in. For a moment, we sat in silence as it sunk in. What Kent had tried to do for me. He suspected some of the paintings might have gotten damaged in the soft crash into the ditch. He'd sensed something heavy slam into his seat from behind. He added that he was kind of hoping the one of the motel room was still okay, and I had to ask which one he meant because it wasn't ringing a bell. It turned out he was talking about the sketch I'd made during my night at the Motel 6 in Lakewood, way back in March. That was the work he'd taken to, that hasty depiction of a room where no one else wanted to be. The only way I'd tried to make it special was experimenting with the shading of the light pollution over the drab skyline. He tried to talk about other things as soon as I let him. The van's engine had sounded a little messed up, he thought. Some weird sloshing sound. Did I know about that? Then there was a mildly cutting word about his sister in Wheeling, who he said he knew wouldn't have come even if they'd been able to reach her. "They're gonna boot me out of here tonight," he said. "There's nothing really wrong with me except that they said they have to wrap my shoulder real tight. I just promised I'd help this nurse fix her glasses. They broke when she was bandaging me." I told him I would definitely come back and walk him out when the time came. I made no mention of my plans to drive back to Lancaster. That was out for the moment anyway. I didn't know if I'd ever see the van again, or the things that had been inside. But none of it seemed terribly important.
Kent wouldn't allow himself to drift off. He told Nadia he was thinking of leaving the area, that he was getting tired of it. He told her he thought about St. Augustine a lot, down in Florida, because he had friends who'd moved there, who'd always told him he could stay with them for a little while, and that the scenery was more interesting, and it was never really crowded. His face conveniently turned away from her. He told Nadia that she should come too. Get out of this town, go somewhere less ugly. Lots of scenery to draw from, maybe. History. Nadia didn't know what to say. She told him that she'd actually been there once before, on a road trip with me and our dad, and that she remembered seeing the Castillo de San Marcos. Kent had read all about that. Her response surely had not been what he'd been hoping for. They sat quietly for a bit, listening to the wind brush the window pane and the sounds of soft talking from the hallway outside. Nadia wasn't able to stay very long because they wanted to take care of Kent's shoulder. She'd wait for his call and come back when he was ready to go. When her options for the van were explained to her over the phone a while later, she told the powers that be to just take it away, and that she'd arranged to get the things from the back later. So that was how the van finally departed this world, having given both of us all that it could.
The hospital's policy was to push outgoing patients in a wheelchair to the front entrance. Waiting on the sidewalk outside, I saw Kent through the glass, coming from around a corner, one long, quiet hallway to go before he was allowed to stand. He walked a little delicately from there, carrying nothing, his shoulders still stiff and certain movements causing him to wince now and again. Interestingly, they'd given him a little rubber ball to put in his shoe, and as long as his foot pressed down on it at a certain angle, he felt okay. He said he didn't feel like going back to his place, and I expected that. We ducked into a Burger King and got sodas, and sitting in a corner booth, I updated him in a long monologue on the goings-on in Vermilion Common, who had left, who had stayed, and what the development project meant for them all. He listened quietly, subdued, offering fewer hard-edged opinions than usual. I reminded myself that though he'd passed a second concussion test, he had been through something that would probably have traumatized me into silence for days. Then I told him I was going to spring for a rideshare for the both of us, because if he was up for it, we were going on a little journey, he and I.
Hey, little chief. Taking a break from cleaning to give an update on something new I got middling with out here. My sister's been running workshops on artist self-forgiveness, letting go of our fixations with our creative flaws, learning to love what we've done instead of losing years of sleep because we just don't think it's good enough. I've taken the workshop twice, believe it or not, and you know what? I dug it. Imagine that. Getting to a point where you're just happy to have painted, and you can look at the results in 1 hour or 1 year or even 20 years and have no hesitations or doubts or regrets about them. Good picture or bad picture, just putting down the brush and letting go. Now, I think that's a lovely thought. Maybe that crazy lady can actually get us there. What a place that would be. I think I've been looking for it all my life.
7 miles east of Vermilion Common, there was an area of Cleveland called Goodrich-Kirtland, which had some charming old working-class neighborhoods. We got out there after a cozy ride in an Uber driven by an aspiring country singer who played his own album as we drove. I told Kent for the first time that my mother had grown up in this area not far from the waterfront, and 30 years later she'd come back after her divorce from my father. This is where she passed away, surrounded by good memories. A lesser strain of the blood disease that had taken her away from us had been inherited by Leo, who was slowly being cured of it. A lot had been discovered about it over the years. "Where's your father live?" Ken asked me, and I said, "San Diego." From Starkweather Avenue, we walked 2 blocks to a lovely old brick building on a tree-lined street. I guided Kent up to one of the front windows, which looked in on a stately foyer lit softly at all hours of the day and night. We saw a winding staircase and a blue marble floor. "What is this place?" Kent asked. It was the Danish Consulate of Cleveland. I pointed out the smallest 3 framed paintings hung in the lobby. It showed an impressionistic view of a horse race around the turn of the 20th century, with faceless fans cheering in a grandstand. "My mother did that one," I told Kent. It was the only painting she had ever sold when she was all of 22. She'd mostly given up her artistic pursuits when she moved to Pennsylvania, married, and had Leo, and then me. The manager of the building had seen that painting in a show set up in a shopping mall. It had stayed hung in the consulate year after year, and it seemed like now it always would, perfectly lit by well-placed bulbs mounted in several places on the grand wall. The pale horses, heads down, streaked in a gray and violet blur of motion, while their riders were more detailed. That night was the second time I'd visited the spot since I'd come to Vermilion Common, to look through the window in nighttime. Kent and I walked down to the water, and we went to a railing and looked out over Lake Erie. The part of the city we would see across the reach was run down and sleepy-looking, tiny lights blinking far away. I looked at Kent's face under the light of a lamppost, so gaunt in that light, unshaven but handsome in a way that time would probably be gentle with. I told him I was going home for a while, that in fact my brother would be arriving that night to take me there. What the future held was a total unknown. I was fairly certain, though, I said, that I would be seeing more of the man from the gallery who I'd been spending time with, that this was something I had decided I wanted. Kent's expression did not change when I told him this. He looked stoically at the moon striping across the surface of the water. I told him then that I was never going to be a great artist. I didn't have the fire for it. In the end, I didn't love it quite enough to give it everything above all else. I couldn't explain it to Kent just then, but the summer had made me realize that much of the reason I'd come to Vermilion Common was not to be that one thing I'd always daydreamed about, but just to be something else, something other than what I'd been before.
She said she wasn't ever going to make a living with her work, wasn't ever going to have a name or a big solo show at a gallery, or be written about in Art in America. She'd still paint and sketch, she was sure of that, but not in pursuit of anything, not chasing sustenance or some great breakthrough. And that was okay, because in place of that fire, she'd begun to think much more about the bigger world around her. She thought about Benny with his sketch pad, and Brett in her big heavy coat, and she told Kent she wanted to find a way to help a very specific kind of soul she saw so often around her, to help them work through the loneliness they had to carry with them every day, help them create some kind of lasting happiness for themselves. She wasn't sure how to go about it, or how to educate herself in what to do, but this wasn't all about finding a profession. It was about truly touching the world in a way she felt she was ready to, instead of always picturing some idealized one on canvas. It was a growing inspiration that felt real and powerful, and it clung to her now as much as anything else ever had.
I reached out and put a hand very gently just below Kent's injured shoulder. He accepted it the way it was meant to be intimate, but not more so than I could ever give. "You'll keep trying to stay the same, though, won't you?" I said to him fondly. I felt my eyes shining. He only nodded, did not speak. There was no hostility in him, no self-pity, no protest, no remorse. He did not drop his gaze. I stepped forward to embrace him, and he allowed me to. And eventually he lifted his hands from his sides to settle them on my back and press there lightly, lingering before letting go. He turned once again to the lake, the wind ruffling his hair. Finally, with one more gentle nod for me, he left the railing and moved past me, headed down the street. In that direction was the commuter train station where the bus lines merged. He was heading back toward the common. I watched him go. Despite his hurting shoulder, his posture was proud and his pace was steady. He walked the same way he always walked, seeming taller than he was, and as if he were going to an important place where people were waiting for him. He had books to write and dreams to dream, but keep only for himself. That image of him on the silent street was something I knew I would paint sometime, to display at a crafts fair maybe, or in a classroom, or maybe it would be just for me.
In December of that year, the attorney working pro bono on behalf of the artists of Vermilion Common managed to win a temporary injunction against demolitions in the Mansheim district. By January, a permanent committee had been set up on their behalf, funded by private donations, some coming from the owners of local galleries. 6 years on, Vermilion Common is still there, and it continues to stretch beyond its original borders with every passing season.